Imagine a young nation, barely 2 decades old, standing at the edge of survival, surrounded by powerful empires, threatened by foreign fleets, and torn by internal doubts. America was about to face a war that would test its very soul. This was no simple conflict. It was a battle for identity, for freedom, for the right to stand tall on the world stage. From the roaring cannons on the Great Lakes to the burning halls of Washington, D.C., from fierce battles with native allies to the forging of legends like Andrew Jackson, the War of 1812 was a story of courage, heartbreak, and unyielding resolve. Join us as we journey back to this defining moment in history, where borders were drawn in fire, heroes were made in blood, and the foundations of modern North America were forever changed. Chapter 1. The Fragile Peace. After the American Revolution, the fragile peace that settled over the newly independent United States in 1783 was like mist rising from a calm morning, quiet, enchanting, and deceptive. Beneath the surface lay tension, the uneasy relationship between America and the empire it had once defeated. The Treaty of Paris granted independence, but questions of power, pride, and unfinished business lingered in every bay, frontier, and capital. The revolution had ended, indeed, but its aftershocks reverberated across a continent. American soldiers, still in ragged uniforms, returned home to fields that had been battlefields. Women who had held families together while men were away now faced the task of rebuilding hearth and home. Towns that once thrived on colonial commerce had been hollowed, their economies disrupted. The country was united in victory, yet divided in fear of collapse, of invasion, and of a future that nobody could yet define. Britain, too, was recovering from war, albeit on a global scale. Though it had ceded territory in North America, it remained a dominant maritime power, enmeshed in European rivalries and with a vast empire to protect. In the minds of British statesmen, the American Revolution was a costly anomaly, not a blueprint, for colonial independence. Their empire had survived, but the rebellion served as a warning that distant territories could one day aspire to autonomy. In those uncertain years, British forts stood on American soil. In the Great Lakes and the Northwest Territory, posts such as Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and Fort Niagara remained garrisoned. Their presence was no accident. Britain justified them by accusing the United States of failing to compensate loyalists whose lives had been devastated during the war. Americans, however, saw these forts as symbols of lingering control, unpaid debts transforming into military occupation. Every creaking suspension of diplomacy deepened the rift. The new United States, watchful in the fragile dawn of nationhood, found its authority undercut. The words peace and victory rang hollow to the eyes that saw British troops in what they believed was sovereign land. American merchants felt the squeeze, too. Across the Atlantic, British merchants and privateers seized American vessels, disrupting trade. Ships laden with tobacco, timber, furs, and rice, goods that should have enriched the Republic, were snatched or delayed. Customs officials under British influence imposed duties that strangled commerce. America's hopes for economic growth were throttled by a hand that had once ruled its markets from London. At the heart of the tension lay a question of maritime rights. Britain's position at sea was undisputed. They boasted the greatest navy the world had ever seen, yet they wielded that power in ways that threatened American interests. Naval blockades, still an accepted tactic of war, now extended into peacetime, targeting freight and freedom. American ships seeking to cross the Atlantic to trade with markets in Europe and the Caribbean found themselves navigating a minefield of red tape, tariffs, and naval patrols. It was during the days of the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict that consumed Europe from 1803 onward, that these strains intensified. Britain and France, locked in mortal combat, declared that neutral ships were fair targets if they traded with the enemy. The United States, determined to stay neutral, found itself caught in the currents of European warfare. A ship flying American, colors laden with goods bound for France, risked capture by British cruisers or seizure by French privateers. So the seas, once the domain of commerce, became a theater of frustration. American sailors risked their lives just to reach a port, and when capture came, the consequences were personal and unrelenting. But perhaps the deepest wound was the practice of impressment. For Americans, it was an outrage that cut deeper than seized goods. British naval officers arguing that deserters from their fleet swept aboard American ships forcibly conscripted sailors into their service. American men, some born in Britain, many in the United States, were torn from deck and family. In letters home to wives and fathers, they described terror, exhaustion, and the betrayal of being used as pawns in imperial games. Fishermen in New England towns shuddered at the thought. The sea that provided their livelihood also served as the realm where foreign navies could drag their loved ones away. Fishermen and merchants shared the same ports, but they shared a deep dread. The sea was no longer safe. In the heat of everyday life, ordinary Americans watched these changes with unresolved anger. Coastal communities wrote furious petitions, urging Congress to act. Newspapers carried headlines suffused with outrage. "British tyranny on the seas," they declared. Patriotism and resentment mixed in barrooms and drawing rooms alike, as families rehearsed the stories of relatives impressed, of trade routes shuttered, of livelihoods imperiled. Washington, too, grew restless. The new capital, Naval, stores still under construction, official pages wandering corridors, filled with debates. George Washington himself, though retired, penned letters urging caution. But Thomas Jefferson, his successor, took a different tack. Hoping to use economic pressure rather than war, he signed the Embargo Act of 1807. In theory, cutting off trade would starve Britain into respecting American neutrality. In reality, it nearly starved the American economy. Ships lay idle in ports, businesses failed, and the embargoes became despised symbols of federal overreach. Most damaging, perhaps, was the growing sense among Americans that diplomacy was failing them. Each British post on American soil, each seized ship, each conscripted sailor told the same story. The empire that America had defeated still loomed large, and the young republic, its government fragile, its institutions new, its unity fragile, seemed powerless. Enter men like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and the Warhawks, young leaders with a message that resonated in towns from Cincinnati to Charleston. The Republic deserved respect, they said. It deserved men on its ships, goods shipped freely, and lands free from Britain's reach. Their vision was muscular, forward, and confident. It offered a remedy for frustration, confrontation, not retreat. Yet for President James Madison, the choice was agonizing. He believed deeply in constitutional government and political restraint. He feared the cost of war, both in treasure and blood. Washington remembered how close victory had come in 1781, but it had come at great cost. Madison asked himself, could this fragile nation survive another war? Diplomats in London sent carefully worded protests. Envoys reminded the British Crown of treaties and neutrality rights. But the British government, preoccupied with Napoleon's armies, was impatient and often dismissive. Its strategy, the Orders in Council, insisted on controlling neutral shipping. The British viewed those rules as cornerstones of maritime supremacy. The Americans, equally fervent, saw them as acts of aggression. Slowly, the fog of hope lifted. Peace had been cherished, but it proved as unstable as mist. In homes across the Republic, men and women carried the weight of decisions not yet theirs. Traders, sailors, soldiers in waiting. It was as if the heart of the nation palpated with a silent drumbeat, warning of storm. When Madison finally convened Congress in 1812, he delivered his address with measured tones. He spoke of wrongs, impressment, trade restrictions, British alliances with native tribes. He spoke of sovereignty. But beneath his words lay a heavier truth. The Republic's patience was exhausted. America could no longer be a passive observer in the games of empires. As winter thawed into spring, the pressure grew. American ports hummed again, this time with the splintering sound of preparations, men drilling in dusty camps, ships creaking as they were fitted for war. The congressional debates crackled with energy. The Warhawks pressed for action. The Federalists pleaded for caution. Then came June 1812, and the moment of decision. With votes tallied, resolutions passed, and history poised on a blade's edge, Congress declared war. The line was crossed, the die cast, and as ink dried on the declaration, the thaw turned into flood, a nation prepared to defend itself, come what may. But before the cannons boom, before the first shots tragically fired, we begin here. We stand at the end of that fragile peace, the peace that was given, that was hoped for, and that ultimately would shatter beneath the weight of pride, principle, and the human cost of empire. As dawn broke over a nation of 13 states, now stretched from coast to the Mississippi, America's experiment in republican government would enter a new chapter. The Revolution's promise, unfulfilled in economic justice and sovereignty, would be tested once more. For the fragile peace of 1783 was gone, and from its remnants rose the conflict of 1812, born of fierce conviction, human ambition, and the ceaseless currents of history. Chapter 2. Trouble on the Seas, Trade Wars, and Naval Dominance. The ocean was never meant to be a battlefield, yet by the early 1800s, the Atlantic waves had become a theater of escalating tensions between empires, projects of wealth, pride, and power colliding in the salt-scented breeze. As Britain and France waged their monumental struggle during the Napoleonic Wars, the young American merchant fleet found itself caught in a storm not of its making, carrying its hopes and freedoms across waters bristling with danger. From the deck of an American merchantman, the sea looked limitless. Laden with tobacco, cotton, timber, and furs, each vessel symbolized the promise of prosperity for a nation still in its infancy. Cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, thrumming, ports pulsating with ambition, relied on the ocean's bounty. But this freedom of the sea was becoming perilously restricted. The British, determined to suffocate their French adversary, extended a naval blockade across the Atlantic, transforming lucrative trade routes into gauntlets of risk. In 1807, Britain issued its first order in council, decreeing that neutral ships bound for French ports must first dock in British harbours, submit to inspection, and pay duties. Any who refused risked seizure. For American captains, this was akin to piracy by another name, a violation of neutral rights and a direct affront to national sovereignty. Yet, for the British, it was a wartime necessity to starve France into submission by choking off its commerce. Across the ocean, Napoleon responded in kind. The Berlin and Milan decrees stipulated that any vessel complying with British blockades was fair prey for French seizure. His ship, flying the stars and stripes, hoping to gracefully thread between warring giants, found itself entrapped. Neutrality meant only risk. Peril was inescapable. The seafarers were caught in a tightening noose. Every voyage risked interception. Every cargo run flirted with confiscation, yet American crews pressed on, driven by contract and need. In port villages from Boston to Savannah, children waved to departing ships, mothers pressed talismans into salty hands, while fathers whispered prayers into the wind. These men embarked on journeys that could bring reward, or detainment, or worse. Stories spread of seized vessels, ships commandeered in broad daylight, sailors taken prisoner, cargoes sold at foreign auctions. The people felt the sting, not just in loss of goods, but in wounded pride. Editors of outspoken newspapers cried tyranny, British injustice, oppression of free trade. Their words stoked the embers of American resentment. But the real terror came not from seized goods alone. It lay in the harrowing Chesapeake leopard affair of June 1807. Just off the coast of Virginia, the American frigate USS Chesapeake prepared for sea when the rogue British ship HMS Leopard hove into view. Officers aboard the Leopard demanded the right to search for British deserters. The Chesapeake's commander, James Barron, refused. Guns roared. The Leopard opened fire, and in minutes, 3 American sailors lay dead, 18 wounded. British. Sailors boarded the Chesapeake and pressed 4 men into service. 3 were alleged British subjects, 1 was an American citizen. The exploding outrage across America was fierce. Not only had violence been done to a ship flying the American flag, but the deed occurred in unambiguous waters. No justification, no apology, just raw, humiliating force. Across taverns and drawing rooms, the event became a rallying cry. Mothers wept before portraits of their sons, street corner speakers demanded retaliation. Weekly newspapers reprinted lithographs of the damaged Chesapeake's rigging, the silent testimony of broken timbers. Few could fail to recognize a nation in denial of dignity. If peace had once been an option, it faded in the wake of that outrage. President Thomas Jefferson, determined to avoid war, attempted a new strategy. He placed an embargo on all American exports to foreign ports. The idea was simple. If England and France could not procure vital American goods, perhaps they would be forced to acknowledge U.S. rights. But the embargo instead backfired. American trade collapsed. Coastal towns languished. Shipyards lay dormant. Farmers and manufacturers found their markets vanished. Black markets emerged. The spirit of resistance soured into near hate for the law. The American economy sputtered as the embargo strangled its lungs. Jefferson's dream of neutrality was stillborn under the weight of economic collapse. The silence where ships once left ports became deafening. Anger shifted from foreign oppression to domestic failings. Americans began clamoring for a return to assertiveness, an outlet to channel their pain into purpose. Meanwhile, the British blockade grew stronger. Naval vessels patrolled the American coast, stopping ships under vague suspicions. Even neutral cargoes, bound for seemingly neutral, harbors were seized without recourse. The legality of it mattered little when British guns could sink a vessel in minutes or drag sailors from their posts. The sea had become a place of dread, not promise. But the American spirit shifted. With each injustice on the waves, the call for retaliation swelled. It was no longer diplomatic protest that stoked the fires of rhetoric. It was anger made personal. The father laid to rest, the son impressed, the cargo sold off in foreign auctions as if declared enemy contraband. Everywhere, vindictive energy spurred a growing determination to take action, to defend American rights, and perhaps to teach Britain a lesson. On the sea, though, there were small victories, occasions of pride that gave a new kind of faith to the unsettled republic. The young U.S. Navy, though modest in size and underfunded, had begun to make its voice heard. Captains like Isaac Hull and Joshua Barney looked for opportunities. On August 19, 1812, the USS Constitution met HMS Guerriere off the coast of Nova Scotia. In a furious exchange of cannon fire, the Constitution outmaneuvered the British frigate. When the smoke cleared, she sailed away victorious. News traveled fast. Americans cheered. The ship, already dubbed Old Ironsides because her sides seemed to repel British cannonballs, became a living emblem of defiance. A single victory off Halifax, blindingly small in the scale of ages, struck on the chord of national pride. These early maritime victories, however limited, revealed the emerging identity of an American seafaring nation, courageous, relentless, and unafraid to challenge the weight of empire. They offered flashpoints of optimism, but they did not change the broader reality. The British naval blockade tightened like a vice. Diplomatic appeals continued to fall on deaf ears. Trade still suffered. Tensions rippled through the bloodstream of the nation. In taverns and on docks, sailors shared their tales of escape and resistance. Fishermen in Maine recalled our Navy's rare but stunning victories. In Boston, shipwrights who had survived the embargo spoke of a return to purpose, repairing hulls, hammering keels, preparing ships for conflict that many now expected was inevitable. Washington, too, hummed with anticipation. Ships docked at Navy Yard with new fittings. Gunpowder barrels were counted and inventoried. Training camps began to grow in the hinterland. Every cabinet discussion considered the same choice. How much longer could America withstand this maritime barrage? Was another revolution possible, or could this republic absorb the cost? By early 1812, as spring began to soften winter's edge, the mesmeric tension hovering offshore drained into national consciousness. The seas had delivered a series of unbearably humiliating insults against American sovereignty. Encroachments, once tolerated in the name of peace, were now perceived as existential violations. The silence of the ocean, once conducive to commerce, seemed now dangerous. each wave telling a story of stolen goods, conscripted hands, broken promises. The story of trouble on the seas is the first wave in this unfolding war. It is a tale of power and principle, of merchants torn from livelihood, sailors dragged into foreign service, and a people who believed their flag should mean more than a wish. It should mean respect. As we close this chapter, we see a nation gathering its will, forging its resolve upon the question of whether maritime freedom is worth declaration of war. In the coming chapters, we will cross that line out of quiet rage into open conflict. From coast to frontier, from Chesapeake to Great Lakes, from the sea to the fields of Canada. But here, on the trembling edge of revolt, we remember, the sea is more than water. It is rights, pride, fate. And the young republic, under waves of outrage and resolve, prepares to declare its worth. Chapter 3. Impressment. Stolen sailors and national rage. The chill of the northern wind carried a familiar dread across coastal towns, an invisible threat drifting in off the sea. It was called impressment. To ordinary Americans, it was more than policy. It was a horror, a theft of identity and freedom carried out in daylight on the high seas. Families, communities, a nation, each felt the sting, each reckoned with the question, could this young republic truly stand while its sons were seized and forced to serve a foreign king? Impressment was the Royal Navy's brutal answer to its chronic shortage of sailors. In an empire spread across the globe, Britain needed manpower. Voluntary enlistment could never fill its vast armadas. The solution, they believed, lay in taking men, any men, found on vessels of any flag, claiming them as British subjects or deserters. In practice, this meant American citizens were ripped from their decks, thrown into foreign service, and made to fight in a war that was not theirs. To understand the weight of this outrage, picture a quiet morning in Boston. A schooner loads barrels of rum and cod. A crew of 10 men, rugged and sunburned, laughs as they secure the sails. The ship's name is painted on the bow, on its stern, the stars and stripes. These men are Americans, a farmer's son, a fisherman's apprentice, a veteran of the Revolution. None suspect that by dusk their lives could be torn apart, and yet it happened. Across the Atlantic, the wind carries British cruisers that patrol neutral waters. They hail the schooner, demanding to board. The crew resists. They have not broken British laws, but the captains have orders. Seize anyone suspected as British. There is no ceremony. Men are dragged below decks, bound in chains, condemned to years of service on foreign ships. The schooner sails on, missing its crew. The empty seats at the tavern table that night tell a quiet, devastating story. One of the most searing examples was the Chesapeake Leopard encounter. On June 23, 1807, the British warship HMS Leopard intercepted the American frigate USS Chesapeake off Norfolk, Virginia. The Chesapeake's captain, James Barron, refused a search. The Leopard opened fire. Cannons roared. In minutes, 3 Americans lay dead. 18 more were maimed. Then the British boarded, seizing 4 men. Their actions were legal by British standards. To Americans, they were sacrilege. Accounts tell of scenes burning with indignation. Mary Lloyd, wife of one impressed sailor, stood at dawn on a crowded pier. Her husband's face was the last she saw before British sailors dragged him aboard. She watched in horror as the ship pulled away, his cries lost on the wind. Was he a deserter, a British subject, or an American whose only crime was sailing for freedom? No one knew. What everyone felt was rage and helplessness. Letters home from impressed American sailors painted grim scenes. Quivering from cold on British decks, they were forced to scrub floors, climb masts, fire cannon, under threat of flogging or death. Some said they were told to renounce their American citizenship or face punishment. Many refused. Their fate, chains and brutality, became their daily fare. Their captors would sometimes mix them among British crew for months, even years, until they died or escaped. Families back in Boston or Charleston waited, tormented, hopeful, and then resigned when none returned. Newspapers exploded with outrage. Editors described the scene. Our flag insulted, our citizens plundered. Petitions poured into Congress. Town meetings passed resolutions. America watched, waiting for its government to reply, and wondered if it had the power to do more than protest. To have one's countrymen stripped from American ships in peacetime felt like a betrayal of the Revolution's promise of liberty. Still, diplomacy took the lead. President Thomas Jefferson and later President James Madison protested formally. Envoys wrote letters, delivered notes, delivered ultimatums. British officials responded with customary politeness and echoes of justification, saying that British subjects would be reclaimed, even if they had travelled under another flag. In London, ministers rationalised, the survival of the empire rested on naval strength. Lives lost or taken were seen as acceptable collateral. For President Madison, the situation was intolerable. He saw the theft of Americans as a violation of sovereignty, of national dignity. Yet he also understood the military weakness of the United States. A war with Britain would come at an expensive cost: lives, money, stability. But as each letter arrived with an American woman's trembling hand, each child's ragged gaze into a silent horizon, those costs became tragically personal. To ordinary citizens, this was more than news. It was a wound. Parents fearful for their sons' wives haunted by silence. Communities racked with the doubt of where their neighbors had gone. Sailors refused to man the merchant ships, and ports slowed. America's maritime lifeblood was turning feeble under British steel. The stolen sailors were not abstractions. They were fathers, husbands, friends, and each stolen man carried with him a spark of national feeling that could not be extinguished. By 1810, the sense of grievance reached into the heart of American identity. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became an oft-repeated refrain in Congress. The language was vivid, the sentiment was fierce. Americans believed they had paid enough, with freedom and blood. Now demands for respect were as loud as the newly mounted cannons along the docks. Madison assembled Congress. The time for protests had passed. The calls for more assertive measures, embargoes, milder retaliation, no longer sufficed. But still, impressment continued. It was a federal crime against America's freedom of the seas. No sailor felt safe. Even ships that sailed under false names, carrying forged documentation, could not escape the cordon of British cruisers. American flags alone no longer signalled neutrality. In the eyes of the British Navy, they meant nothing at all. In private diaries, American sailors wrote of desperation. "I am a slave," one turned merchant marine wrote in 1811, "of another kingdom whose wars I do not wage, whose king I do not serve." The bitterness of these words came from deep personal loss, safety, identity, choice. They sowed seeds of defiance in America's maritime communities, a readiness to resist, even at the risk of war. In towns like Salem and Charleston, communities passed resolutions demanding retribution. In Congress, voices like Henry Clay's thundered, "Our dignity, our flag, our men, each are assaulted, we must act." The Warhawks pressed their case. Peaceful measures had failed. The nation was under attack, not by shots across the frontier, but by the slow, grinding theft of the sea. Then, in March 1812, Madison sent a message to Congress outlining an extraordinary proposal. He recommended, short of war, general embargoes, naval expansion and economic retaliation. He knew war loomed, but he demanded a last stand for dignity. Congress approved the rechartering of the Navy, bolstered coastal defenses, and funded new frigates. They empowered the president to enact selective trade bans. The stolen sailors had sparked a change. America would no longer be a silent victim. Still, the stolen sailors remained missing. Their faces haunted tavern walls etched in hearts. The list of names grew. Thomas Leonard, pressed in 1810, Samuel Hawks, seized in 1811, James Riley, torn from his ship in 1812. Their stories became stories of martyrdom, sacrifices that strengthened national resolve. Finally, by June 1812, the political tide shifted. Congress voted for war. Madison signed the Declaration. The die was cast. A young nation, still fragile, still divided, had drawn its line. Its citizens, its flag, its honor would no longer be taken by force. Impressment, that terrible practice. To have stolen souls was more than an injustice. It was a moment of reckoning. The violation of individuals moved the nation, the sorrow of families, the outrage in town squares, the courage of those who still frowned at British saltwater, yet sailed on. That was the crucible that forged war. But once the war began, would those stolen sailors be remembered? Would they be redeemed, avenged? Or would they be swallowed by history's currents like so many wooden ships beneath the waves? Soon the answer would come in the form of battle reports, in the struggle for Great Lakes and rivers, in the thunder of Alabama pistols. But in this moment, on the eve of war, one thing was clear. The theft of American lives, the wounding of a nation's soul, had ended the fragile peace and propelled the Republic into war. The stolen sailors may have been lost to the British decks, but their spirit returned home in the hearts of a united and enraged people. Chapter 4. Native Resistance and British Influence in the West. The western frontier was a world unto itself, wild, vast, and fiercely contested. For centuries, indigenous nations had lived in harmony and conflict across these lands, weaving a rich tapestry of culture, diplomacy, and warfare. But as American settlers pressed westward after 1783, they found that the territory was neither empty nor welcoming. It was native land, defended by proud nations determined to resist invasion. In the early 1800s, these nations encountered a formidable ally, the British. Though Britain had lost its 13 colonies, it retained a strategic interest in North America. Along the Great Lakes, their remaining forts, Niagara, Detroit, Michilimackinac, loomed on the frontier like silent sentinels. British agents and traders maintained diplomatic and economic ties with native tribes, who found in them a counterweight to American expansionism. This relationship, born of necessity and negotiation, would become a flashpoint in the War of 1812. Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader of commanding presence, understood the mounting threat with clarity and urgency. Tall, dignified, and charismatic, he spoke of a confederation, a united front of tribes stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Tecumseh believed that only unity could preserve native lands, cultures, and autonomy. Alone, each tribe risked isolation and defeat. United, they might stand firm. Alongside him stood his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet. His vision was spiritual, a return to ancestral ways, rejection of alcohol and European goods, and revival of indigenous identity. Together they infused their movement with political purpose and sacred conviction, inspiring resilience in villages that had endured loss, disease, and displacement. Yet, no alliance survives without support. Native diplomacy converged with British interests. British agents provided firearms and ammunition. They helped facilitate trade, which strengthened native economies. At the same time, Great Britain gained an edge, a network of allies who could impede American troop movements and settlements advancing from the east. Moral currents intertwined with imperial strategy, and the western frontier became a crucible of competing ambitions. In settlements like Vincennes and Fort Wayne, ambushes and skirmishes reflected deeper tensions. Families barricaded doors, fathers took up muskets, and travelers whispered of danger on forest trails. The land itself seemed to tremble under the strain. War was seldom declared formally on the frontier, but the violence spoke for itself. When American forces struck Prophetstown in 1811, the spiritual heart of Tecumseh's alliance, they expected quick victory. Instead, they found villages ablaze, symbols shattered but spirits unbroken. The devastation confirmed American strength and the will of native leaders to resist. Tecumseh, though wounded by loss, persevered. He traveled from tribe to tribe, his voice ringing across councils of elders and warriors. "The ground we stand on is ours," he declared. "It feeds us, it shelters us, and we will not surrender it." His presence galvanized support. Miami, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Winnebago, nations whose names would echo through every treaty and battle yet to come. All the while, British forces watched. They saw in Tecumseh's alliance an opportunity to check American momentum. Inside Ottawa and Quebec, commanders authorized arms shipments to native bands. Agents mapped settler trails, noted army looks of readiness, and prepared for escalation. With each fusillade that cut through forest gloom, British and native ambitions merged. America responded with impatience. To Washington, the frontier was manifest destiny in motion. Democracy was expanding outward, and British meddling was an affront. The Warhawks, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, denounced native resistance as a crime of British instigation. They called for retaliation, for opening new battlefronts along the Great Lakes and rivers feeding west. And so soldiers marched into contested territory, regulars alongside militia, white uniforms among the green camouflage of forest. Log cabins, once safe havens, were turned into fortresses. Scouts moved quietly beneath canopies, listening, waiting for smoke or footsteps. Ambush was everywhere. The war was personal. Yet in every skirmish, the native presence was more than anger. It was strategy. Map of rivers and ridges told their story. Waves of destroyer muskets through swamp mist, flanking movements through foliage. That was their technique. They were defenders, familiar with the sounds of forest life, with sacred trails older than any European nation. Prophetstown, though broken, was not destroyed in spirit. Settlements spread out anew, embers carried on wind, gatherings held in hidden groves. Prayers to the ancestors drifted up around campfires at night. The prophet and Tecumseh spoke of continued resistance, even as American soldiers advanced upon Detroit and Fort Harrison. Detroit fell, yet not without tens of lives behind its walls. Fort Harrison was besieged, though it held. Every footprint westward was hampered by resistance. It was not British might that slowed American progress. It was native resolve, nurtured by ancestral ties and armed by imperial friends. Britain, in turn, escalated its support. Fur traders became couriers. Fort provisions arrived alongside revolvers. British regiments stationed near the frontier used Indian scouts to guide sorties. Military correspondence reveals cautious approval. The alliance was effective, but it had to be managed. Britain would not openly declare war through native fire, but it would not restrain its partners. The frontier blurred the lines. Was the war Anglo-American? Or was it also indigenous? Perhaps the most truthful answer was both. The shadow of empire and the agon of native defense merged in the forest, in the river valleys, in the souls of those whose homelands rang with musket and drum. But the alliance had its vulnerabilities. Tecumseh's vision required unity across diverse nations, each with its differences, histories, and wounds. Not all chiefs agreed. Some feared retaliation, others resented British priorities. Internal disagreements and the relentless assaults by settlers and troops fractured cohesion. Still, Tecumseh persisted. On journeys through Mississippi lands, he renewed pledges. At Hawks' call councils, he sealed alliances. At river crossing, he left behind timber stakes and warning signs. His great struggle was to hold together a scattered people amid intensifying settlement. The violence expanded. Tippecanoe in 1811 saw American militia clash with native warriors loyal to Tecumseh. The prophet himself stood alongside his people, though he could not hold the line. The battle ended in retreat. Prophetstown fell. The shock echoed through native lands. But Tecumseh, his courage undimmed, mourned, not for his city, but for opportunity lost. Yet he continued onward. To British generals and fur traders, he became an essential ally. To American opponents, a man to be stopped. When the War of 1812 was declared in June, the frontier became a principal theater. American command anticipated swift action, clear the land of British influence and native aggression. But the land itself resisted them. Forest, marsh, river, ridge, each made assault costly, each slowed the promise of unstoppable expansion. Along the Thames in 1813, the confrontation culminated. Tecumseh and his warriors, British regulars and militia gathered amid autumn colours. Musket fire lit the dawn. The battle was fierce, fluid, brutal. Yet Tecumseh led from the front until he fell, a mortal wound that deflated his confederation. In that moment, the alliance began to unravel. British presence retreated from frontier towns. Reservations and treaties replaced confederations. American settlement poured in, tapping fertile valleys and rivers, China smooth by sunrise. The Northwest Territory changed forever, shaped by lives lost and promises broken. The war in the West did not end with Tecumseh's death, but the dream of unified native resistance did. The frontier became open ground, shaped by treaties that favored settlers, by tribes displaced or absorbed, and by promises never kept. In the end, the story of native resistance is one of struggle, dignity, and heartbreak. Tecumseh's alliance remains an emblem of indigenous resilience, an assertion of sovereignty, in the face of overwhelming pressure. British support was critical, but not decisive. Without the will to preserve their lands, native nations would have had little to resist. With it, they carved a moment of defiance. As the war continued, the memory of those campaigns lingered. Treaty negotiations in Ghent would mention indigenous land, but only as bargaining chips, never as equal parties. The stories of warriors, villages burned, lives displaced, those passed into tribal memory, into songs, into oral histories. When the frontier finally fell silent, the land had changed. The echoes of rifle fire returned to bird calls. The villages were gone. The forts remained. The tide of settlement surged west, built on the memorials of lives lost in conflict. But the chapter of native resistance shaped the war, and shaped the nation's conscience, even if it was soon to be forgotten. The alliance with Britain created hope. The deaths at Thames turned that hope tragic, and in the end both power and pride were lost. The western frontier, once alive with hope and resistance, now lay open, fields cleared, towns rising. The canvas of North America had changed, but the silence across the land carried memory, grief, and enduring testimony to those who had fought for home. Tecumseh walks the paths of legend now, his words spoken at council, his deeds retold by elders. His alliance, though brief, remains a lesson in unity and loss. The frontier, once contested, became foundations for a nation. But the blood and promise of native resistance echo beneath its plains. And for those who listen, the story is not over. Chapter 5. Rise of the Warhawks, Voices for War in Washington. The halls of Congress reverberated with a different kind of energy in the winter of 1811, an energy more fierce than any debate on debt or agriculture. It was ambition, pride, and indignation merged with the voices of young men determined to shape a new nation's destiny. They called themselves Warhawks. Their simple message was electric. America must stand up. America must defend itself. America must go to war. Henry Clay of Kentucky was their fiercest voice. Tall, charismatic, and eloquent beyond his years, Clay spoke of honor as if it were flesh and bone. In his gravel-textured voice, the British acts of impressment, blockade, and alliance with native tribes were not mere grievances. They were insults to the Republic's very soul. Clay thundered across the chamber, "The mace is broken, our flag insulted, and now we must show the world we are no longer content to bow." Opposite him stood John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, equally fiery, though quieter in delivery. Calhoun spoke of principles, neutral rights, maritime freedom, national integrity. He warned that the Republic's resolve would be tested not just by petitions or protest, but by moral strength. "We must act," he said, "not only because they frighten our sailors, they frighten our spirit." They were young men, no older than their nation's earliest patriots. Many were veterans of the Revolution's memory, sons of its heroes, inheritors of its mythology. Their sense of destiny was potent. They believed America's moment had come, to claim a voice in the councils of nations, to defend its sailors, and to wrest control of its own shores. But what drove these Warhawks? Their voices carried more than bravado. For men who represented frontier communities, from Ohio's forests to Tennessee's rivers, the war was personal. Families had been raided, homes burned, crops trampled. Native resistance, often armed by British agents, was no abstraction. It was close pain, close fear. These politicians were not aristocrats droning in distant halls. They were relatives of settler families who had laid waste to their lives. In one speech, Clay recalled walking the banks of the Ohio River, the earth red with settlers' blood. He spoke of hearing the tales of ambush and kin carried away into the woods. When he described the riverbank's silent stones, each a tribute to someone lost, The chamber grew silent, the young man's eyes shining beneath candlelight. The war. Hawks also understood that America needed symbols, victories, declarations, fortitude to define its identity. They were not content with moral outrage. They demanded action. Resolutions piled up in committee rooms, embargoes tightened, navies strengthened, declarations drafted. They urged the creation of new warships, 18-gun brigs, heavy frigates, corvettes built to challenge British ships on the waves. They demanded volunteers. They demanded resolve. Their rhetoric terrified their opponents. Federalists rooted in New England's mercantile classes warned, "War threatens commerce, credit, prosperity." But their pleas fell on ears that heard only British cannons against American merchantmen. Everywhere the voices of the Warhawks drowned out caution. Their arguments were simple. America deserved respect, rights, and a place on the stage. They said, diplomacy has failed. The tempo of Congress changed. Debates, once long and rambling, became taut and sharp. Questions of maritime law gave way to arguments about cannon diameter, troop strength, and frontier fortifications. Evening sessions ended in drafting resolutions. That this House, on due consideration, recommends war. Yet the Warhawks also recognized the human cost. Henry Clay visited the new forts being built in Ohio. He spoke to young volunteers, barefooted and bright-eyed, who didn't yet know what they would endure. He placed a hand on their shoulders and reminded them of sacrifice, of their parents' sacrifice, of the blood that had birthed the Republic. He spoke of fighting for their children's children, of victory that would echo in grandfathers' tales one day. Their call was not empty. Orphans and widows joined prayer meetings for soldiers, ministers preached of righteous war, Latin phrases quoted the rights of man and the examples of Greece and Rome. The nation, though divided, was becoming united in anticipation. America had found its cause, not only to be free, but to be strong. Even as the Warhawks' voices rose, President Madison listened. He was still cautious, still aware of the weight of war. But he could no longer ignore the nation's mood. Clay's speeches, quoted in newspapers across Virginia and Kentucky, bore a power Madison could not deny. The Warhawks were defining America's will. And so June approached. Final resolutions were delivered. Votes were taken. The chamber, including Warhawks, Federalists, veterans, lined up. The tally was close yet decisive. A formal declaration would soon follow. Soon America would no longer endure quietly, not in word, not in deed. From Washington to frontier settlements, towns read the news. Church bells tolled, ports flew flags, drums beat in training grounds. War, once a distant rumor, was about to become questions of life and death. By the dawn of June 18, 1812, the Warhawks had done more than rally Congress. They had rallied a nation. Their voices had carried fear, memory, and resolve across plantations, farms, forests, and merchants' docks. Their war was not born in bloodlust. It was born of resistance, of pride, of the collective will to define America's place in a world where empires spoke loudly. The Warhawks were not warriors. They were visionaries. They saw in war a possibility of national unity, of sovereignty, of a republic moving from the defensive to the commanding. In their speeches, America became more than a collection of states. It became a cause. And so the Warhawks spoke history into being. Not by cavalry charge, but by argument and indignation. The nation listened, and as the final votes were counted, one question stood: would those words forged in candlelight withstand the fires of war? Would the dream of Republican dignity survive the crucible of battle? In that moment the young Republic paused, holding its breath. The Warhawks had raised their voices. The nation had answered. Tomorrow the declaration would be drawn. But tonight the Republic listened, feeling each echo of the Warhawks' cry, reverberating off marble columns and wooden pews, across silent farms and restless cities. War was coming, and the voices that made sense of it had been heard. Chapter 6. James Madison's Dilemma: Diplomacy or War? James Madison sat at his writing desk in the presidential residence, quill in hand, a furrow etched between his brows. The year was 1812, and the weight of history pressed upon him. Before him lay letters from distraught mothers, petitions from traders ruined by British seizures, and the speeches of fiery congressmen demanding war. And yet, just beyond his window, the Potomac River flowed on in its steady, unassuming course, as if time itself demanded calm rather than conflict. Madison was not a man of impulse. He had shaped the Constitution. He had worked to forge a republic built on reason and restraint. He believed deeply in diplomacy, in the careful exercise of statecraft. But with each British ship that seized an American vessel, each sailor forced into service, each native raid supported from Canada, diplomacy felt like a cracked thin ice, unstable and insufficient. In the winter of 1811, he convened his cabinet, a circle of earnest faces around a low fire. They spoke in measured tones of treaties, embargoes, refusals. Their arguments were sober. We warn, we argue, we wait. But Madison's heart weighed differently. He heard every clamor for justice, saw every torn letter from sailors' families, felt the pulse of a nation growing impatient. Whose voice was he to silence? Whose pain was he to ignore? That spring, Madison sent envoys across the Atlantic to London to deliver formal protests against impressment and interference with trade. But weeks stretched into months before replies arrived. British officials, caught up in the whirlwind of Napoleonic ambitions, scarcely listened. Orders in council remained intact. British forts remained on American soil. The Royal Navy continued to stop and board American ships at will. At home, the rhetoric shifted. The Warhawks, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Felix Grundy, no longer called for negotiation. They demanded action. "This is not a child's game," Clay declared in the House of Representatives, his voice rising. "We must defend our rights, or lose them." Calhoun spoke of national honor. A republic which cannot defend its sailors cannot defend its people. Madison read their addresses on the front page of each morning's newspaper. He watched towns hold prayer meetings for deliverance and drills begin in backcountry fields. Volunteers enlisted in droves. Citizenship was becoming a burden of blood. Yet Madison's mind circled back to reason and risk. The nation's army was small, untrained. The treasury was shallow. Could the United States honestly face a global empire? Could he, with integrity, advise Congress to raise the banner of war? Could he look into the eyes of those mothers, some in Maryland, others along the Gulf, whose sons might never return? He considered a middle course. He supported rechartering the Navy. He backed the construction of new frigates. He sanctioned defensive fortifications. He signaled resolve without yet signaling war. His annual message to Congress struck a cautious tone, condemning British actions, but still hoping for rights to be restored through patience and pressure. But passion burned faster than patience. Each day brought fresh stories. A vessel boarded near Nova Scotia, its crew pressed into service. A family rejected official compensation for losses on Lake Erie. Madison faced a chorus of pleas. His conscience pulled him one way, his caution pulled him another. Diplomacy felt hollow, but what lay beyond it? Late one evening, as candles dimmed and guards paced outside the door, Madison drafted a letter to his closest advisor. He wrote of the throb of indignation in every town he passed. He confessed to feeling the nation's soul tied to every sailor's fate. But he also spoke of his fear that war could shred the Republic's fragile fabric, that it could pivot into disaster. He waited for a response. A few days later, Clay, responding from the House floor, spoke of national destiny. "We are far beyond the point of patient petition," Clay said. "If we do not rise now, we will fall." Madison felt the ground shift. He realized that in this season, leadership meant bearing both the torch and the burden, igniting the moment to act, while carrying the cost of consequences. Inside his study, he drafted language carefully. He would recommend war, but not lightly. He spelled out the grievances: impressment, blockade, violation of treaties, British support for native attacks. He appealed to Congress to weigh risk against principle. He said, if Britain persists, if our sailors cannot sail free, if our national sovereignty is denied, we must defend those rights. We must stand for what we are. On June 1st, 1812, Madison delivered his address. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. He spoke firstly of a nation ambushed, its flag insulted, its laws scorned. He described the slow evaporation of neutrality turning into national peril. He spoke with evidence, but also with humanity, evoking the sailor's wife, the father at home, the tradesman at the docks. He paused, measured each word, then released the final lines, that if Great Britain continued its naval aggressions, then war would be the only way to secure peace upon honourable terms. The chambers fell into a hush broken only by rustling papers. Madison's counsel was clear, but the moment was heavy. Congress would decide. The nation would feel. Over the next days, legislators introduced declarations of war. Votes were cast. Speeches made. Madison watched from the sidelines, hoping that action would not undo his country, but fearing that inaction already had. On June 18th, the decision fell. Congress declared war. Madison's signature, applied deliberately, was both a culmination of months of deliberation and the beginning of a national trial. In that act, Madison's dilemma found its resolution, not because he desired war, but because he recognized a duty beyond caution. He saw diplomacy fail the nation's heart, and concluded that when a country's children were seized, its laws mocked, its dignity questioned, resolution became responsibility. As he sealed the papers, the candle flickered. He thought of the battles to come, on the sea, in the forests, on the lakes. He thought of the costs that would be paid in flesh and coin. Yet, beneath those doubts, he also felt an anchor, the conviction that a republic must sometimes risk itself to remain free. The die was cast, the nation stood, and Madison, in that new dawn of war, understood that the line between hope and necessity had been crossed, and that history would judge both his choice and its cost. The war would be hard, the battles unexpected, the outcomes uncertain. But on that morning, as the letter bearing news of war reached towns across the land, America stepped forward with its president's resolve, even as he carried the burden of war in his heart. Chapter 7, Declaration of War. America crosses the line. June 18, 1812. The lamps in the Senate chamber glowed against a night steeped in tension. Across the nation, whispers had flickered into certainty. America would no longer quietly endure. That evening, ink met parchment under the solemn signature of President Madison. Congress had declared war on Great Britain. And with that simple phrase, "War be hereby declared," the fragile, hopeful peace of generations was shattered. The months leading to this moment had been a crucible. Anger had simmered in every sea-tossed fishing village, in every riverfront, milltown, and behind every closed door where a mother counted the days without her son. The embargoes, the seizures, the stolen sailors, they had been affronts to dignity. Now a people who had once trembled under distant rule were refusing to tremble again. They had resolved to stand, to defend, to fight. Inside the ornate chamber, senators and representatives rose and sat, voices rising and falling like tides. Some spoke of solemn duty and sober sacrifice, others thundered with pride, urgency, righteous indignation. They invoked burned shipdecks, torn sails, bloodied fathers, stories that filled taverns and print shops back home. They spoke as though each nugget of grief, each twisted plank of wooden wreckage demanded retribution. When the vote was tallied, a nation held its breath. It was not unanimous, far from it, but it passed. War was declared. The Union, still fragile, had taken a step into uncertainty. It had chosen risk over restraint, and it was not just a legal act. It was a collective heartbeat, pulsing with resolve. Outside the Capitol, torches were lit along Pennsylvania Avenue. Crowds gathered beneath a canvas sky, cheering for a cause that felt both terrifying and right. Drums began to roll. Bells rang. In nearby districts, the war began not merely on the deck of a ship lost at sea, but with the voices of 87 senators and 141 representatives who said, "Enough." And yet, so many questions remained. What would a nation of humble farms and fledgling factories do against the British Empire? Could America's tiny navy challenge the greatest that had ever ruled the waves? Could militia, mostly citizens with musket and plough, stand against disciplined soldiers and Indian allies? In homes, families prayed beneath candlelight. Farmers paused mid-harvest. Merchants watched ships idling at harbor. Sailors, docked in Baltimore and Charleston, prepared to set sail with uncertain fates. Even the year's summer heat felt charged with expectation, as though July itself waited to inhale the smoke of battle. Beyond the borders, diplomats in London glanced at headlines, then turned back to Napoleonic maneuvering. They saw America as a nuisance, yet also a symbol. If America stood, could other empires listen? To the British, this was a test not just of foreign policy, but of imperial resolve. And so the declaration of war echoed beyond legalities. It was the beating of drums, the raising of flags, the tremor in the water as ships prepared to weigh anchor. It was the trembling of a nation that had once trembled at foreign powers and now refused to tremble again. That night, across frontiers and farmlands and smoky ports, Americans paused. They thought of independence won 30 years earlier. They thought of soldiers who had slept on Valley Forge's frozen ground. They thought of the sacrifices still to come. And in that moment, uncertain and charged, they stepped over the line. America had declared war. The die was cast. The fight would come in cannon fire and bayonets, in icy northern forests and sun-baked southern fields, on lakes and rivers and sea. The war would stretch minds, hearts, and souls. But on June 18, 1812, it began. With law, with resolve, with emotional force. A nation had said enough. A nation had resolved to defend itself. A nation had crossed the line. And what followed would shape its future in ways that not even its fiercest advocates could fully foresee. Chapter 8. Invasion Gone Wrong. Detroit and Canada Campaign Fails. The winter sky over Detroit in 1812 was low and ashen, like a mirror to the desperation that crept through the ranks of the U.S. Army. This was supposed to be America's moment, a swift blow that would carry the young republic into Canada, confident and unconquered. Instead, cold winds whispered through empty camps, and faith froze in the hearts of thousands who had marched north with hope in their eyes. From Washington to Boston, America's leaders had dreamed of victory across the northern border. Conquering Canada, they believed, would be decisive, neutralize British influence on the frontier, protect settlers, and show the world that this nation had teeth. Yet dreams rarely face the harsh face of reality, and by early July those dreams would unravel in ways more tragic than anyone expected. It began with General William Hull, a veteran of the Revolution, appointed to lead the American forces from Michigan Territory. He was a man of measured spirit, cautious by nature, and that caution would become his undoing. Hull arrived in Detroit, raising the American flag on the shores of the Detroit River, convinced that the mere presence of U.S. troops would intimidate the British and sway the nearby native allies to remain neutral. But hubris met the truth. The British in Canada had forged relationships, armed and organized native bands, and planned their defense well. Hull crossed into Canadian territory at Sandwich, present-day Windsor, but his forces faltered almost immediately. Supply lines were thin, sentries under strength, and morale brittle. News filtered in of native warriors allied with the British, warriors loyal to Tecumseh's Confederacy, ready to resist any advance. Hull hesitated. He feared a massacre in the woods, an ambush that he could not repel. His trusted officers pleaded for action. Civilians, settlers drawn into the occupation, waited anxiously. Yet Hull's gaze remained fixed on defense. On July 12, 1812, Major Edmund P. Gaines led a small detachment across the river to Fort Amherstburg. They found it lightly held and briefly raised the stars and stripes before retreating. It was a symbolic moment, a glimmer of hope, before practical realities stamped it out. The Americans were ill-equipped for the Canadian wilds. Supplies dwindled, discipline frayed. Troops, many untrained and poorly clothed, grew restless as British warships appeared upriver, threatening the American naval gunboats. Misinformation proved more dangerous than any bullet. Hull received exaggerated reports. Hundreds of British regulars were massing, backed by thousands of native allies. Some claimed they were being pursued through the forest at every turn. Whether intentional or accidental, the effect was the same. Immobilization. On July 16th, as the British General Isaac Brock approached Detroit, Hull held a council of war. The sense of defeat was palpable. Society officers glancing at uniform cuffs saw soldiers with hollow eyes. Volunteers, once fiery, were cowed by rumors. Civilians sheltered in homes asked what had gone wrong. Grit replaced optimism. Dread replaced determination. That night, Hull made his fateful choice. He drafted orders to surrender. His words were formal, yet his hand shook. As Commander-in-Chief of the forces under my command. It was one of the most astonishing surrenders in American history. A fortified city, well-armed, offering no resistance, turned over to the British without a fight. On July 17, 1812, 2,500 American troops marched out of Fort Detroit, unshackled, unbloodied yet defeated. Back in Washington, shock followed disbelief. Newspapers accused Hull of cowardice. The Warhawks denounced it as treason. The administration scrambled to regroup, but the physical and psychological damage was deep. The northern frontier trembled, Canadian morale soared, native bands renewed their resistance. Hull would face a court-martial, the army would struggle to recover, and for the soldiers who surrendered, returning home was a bitter journey marked by humiliation. But Detroit was only the beginning. Emboldened by their success, British forces pressed into Michigan. Meanwhile, American plans to invade Upper Canada via the Niagara frontier faltered. Brigadier General Stephen Van Rensselaer, leading New York militia across the river at Lewiston and Queenston, found himself up against fortified positions and swift British counterattacks. On October 13th, in the Battle of Queenston Heights, militia panic forced American troops to retreat. General Isaac Brock, leading the defense, was killed, but British forces held the field. American lives were lost in scattered skirmishes along the frontier. Resource mismanagement compounded the failure of Detroit, revealing a military machine unprepared for offensive war. The failures of these early campaigns revealed a deeper truth. The Republic's exalted dreams were built on fragile foundations. Supply chains stretched thin across lakes and forests. Troops lacked battle-tested basics like proper uniforms, trained officers, and coordination with naval forces. Worse, America's leaders underestimated the resolve of their opponents and the complexity of frontier campaigns. Red-coated regulars would bugle at dawn. Native warriors would vanish and reappear like ghosts. The land itself would test every inch of progress. As winter approached, the American forces retreated, licking wounds, nursing shame. Detroit remained under British control. The Niagara frontier would see repeated battles and burnings over the coming year. The hope of swift conquest lay shattered. America was learning the hard way that to fight Britain required more than passion. It required planning, discipline, and political will. Behind the military failures lay human stories. Soldiers, barely trained, awoke at midnight to learn they were prisoners. Families at home heard rumors of cowardice. Letters spoke of hunger, of tears, of defeat. Officers resigned in shame. Communities that had cheered the departure of troops now received back their sons in unmarked coffins. Canada, in contrast, saw in these victories a sense of nationhood, a proof that resistance and loyalty could repel conquest. But the war would continue. American leaders would regroup, militia would train, naval officers would sharpen their tactics. Detroit would be the crucible of early defeat, a lesson in hubris, humility, and the high cost of assumption. That winter, Americans around hearths and parlor fires spoke in hushed tones of disgrace, but also of the resolve needed to right the ship. If the first invasion had failed, it had also awakened the Republic to the realities of war and the need to master them. In the darkness, a resolve smoldered. The next campaigns would demand more, but America had felt the sting of failure, and few would forget it. For every man who surrendered a fort, there would be another to fight and die. For every village lost on the Niagara frontier, another town would rise to send troops. Detroit's fall would shape the war for years, reminding a nation that crossing the line was easy, but staying true to the fight would require far more than courage. It would require character, preparation, and unity. And so, Detroit's story is not just one of failure, it is a mirror. It showed America what war meant. It showed that spotty uniforms, thin rations, and naive expectations were not enough. It showed the need for preparation before pride. But beyond the failure lay determination. The Republic would rebuild. And, when winter thawed the frost of defeat, a nation would journey again northward, with clearer eyes, firmer purpose, and lessons dearly learned. Chapter 9. The Battle of Queenston Heights. Late October dawned over the Niagara River, a chill in the October air and a tension heavy on every brow. On October 13, 1812, American forces launched their first major attempt to invade Upper Canada, across the narrow stream that separated two nations, and in that fragile morning light, they believed that bloodshed and battle might redefine their hopes. This would be their moment to seize Canada, to avenge the disaster at Detroit, and to strike a blow at British pride. But war has a way of delivering truth harshly, and at Queenston Heights that truth would be swift, cold, and unrelenting. Across the river, on the Canadian shore, redcoats stood at the ready, regulars, militia, and Indigenous allies arrayed, behind red banners and the promise of victory. They were commanded by Major General Sir Isaac Brock and his trusted Shawnee ally Tecumseh. Here strength was organized, purpose was shared, and the land itself was reverent. Rocky ridges and scattered trees carved a stage where destiny would be decided. The American force, under the command of Brigadier General Stephen Van Rensselaer, crossed in boats before dawn, burdened with ambition and uncertainty. Between 30 and 40 men launched each craft in whispered silence. Their officers, men of privilege more used to debating than battling, called them forward with words of promise that they would secure a foothold and broaden the invasion by day's end. But the water, cold and unassuming, carried no assurances. As the boats rode under moonlight's fade, soldiers wondered whether this fight would redeem Detroit or doom them again. At dawn, the first wave hit the Canadian height. Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer, brother-in-law to the general, climbed with 40 men, planting the flag atop rock and timber. It was a symbolic moment, marked with cheers and cannon smoke, yet fragile. The ground beneath them was steep. Their lines were thin, reinforcements lagged. From their vantage, they could see their comrades building absences on the far bank, boats half-filled, troops hesitating, water between patriotism and panic. The British responded with immediate precision. A detachment under Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonell rushed uphill, muskets cracking, only to stagger by an American volley that felled their leader within moments. MacDonell lay dying beneath the flag he sought. Worse yet, leadership crumbled under firefight. The height exchanged hands multiple times in hours more confusing than cruel. The wind carried cries of, "Push on! Hold fast! Retreat!" Redcoats fell among the rocks. American militia hesitated. Below, on the riverbank, General Brock arrived. His presence galvanized the defenders. Seeing the flag still flying despite threats and blood, he led his men upward, pistol in hand, voice throaty with resolve. "Take that hill!" He fired. Steady, single shot, golden moment as Brock died instantly to musket wound, falling on the ridge. The battle was tipped. His death transformed from loss to symbolic fuel. For his men, Brock became a martyr. For the Americans, his death stoked fear. Wordless panic rippled among militia. Boats drifted, some ferrying terrified contingents back across to American soil. Shots still cracked, but coordination collapsed. Order turned to instinct, fight or flight. For every man who pressed on, another wavered. Atop the ridge, tensions strained. American troops held the flag but were surrounded. Communication faltered. Supplies ran low. British regulars dug in. Native allies positioned along flanks. Added pressure no American line could repel. Surrender, once scarcely permissible, began to look inevitable. When the British and Allied troops finally surrounded the hill, General Van Rensselaer was unwilling to risk total annihilation. He approached Tecumseh's line and with dignity surrendered. The words echoed across rock and valley, "I yield." It was a surrender not of soldiers, but promise. Promise that America might march north and change the course of war. That promise died atop Queenston Heights. In Lower Canada, cheers rang. The border towns breathed a unified relief. Bishops' churches rang with bells of thanksgiving. Soldiers laid wreaths for Brock. In Upper Canada, loyalty was renewed. Volunteers flocked to regiments, determined not to yield again. In America, the reaction was sharp. Newspapers headlined, "Defeat at Queenston, Hope Betrayed." Communities that had sent sons north mourned those lost and captured. Towns demanded accountability. The Warhawks, who'd hoped Canada would fall swiftly, found silence sterile. Congress met. General Van Rensselaer's resignation was tendered. His promise of conquest had turned to rubble. But among Americans, especially those who had crossed into Canada, the ideals that carried them remained. Their march east had been bold. They had learned the harsh shape of war, where flags, even bright, offer no guarantee, where valor alone cannot carry a nation, and where battlefields are shaped as much by terrain and timing as by courage. Queenston Heights confirms that war is not a test of spirit alone. It tests organization, training, supply chains, leadership. It tests the will of a nation to invest, like Locke's Compact, requiring both sacrifice and sustenance. Canada was not a prize for the taking. It was a shield held firm by people who believed in its defense. For the Americans taken prisoner, the return journey was long, on foot or aboard prison ships, through Canada's wilds, through winters arriving, through reconciliation with failure. Some were paroled into rotisseries and taverns, others were exchanged, yet each carried home stories of blurred faces and burning heights, plunging defeat and unflagging hope that something greater would rise. By the war's end, Queenston Heights would be taught in schools, America's first major defeat on land, but overshadowed by later victories at Lake Erie, Baltimore, New Orleans. It would become a chapter, not a conclusion. The Republic might walk humbly, but it had not fallen. But the ridge remained, and on it died visions of conquest and illusions of easy war. Canada required its defenders. America required its challengers. Their conflict, it would span lakes and forests, cities and farms. The war's currents would flow into diplomacy, commerce, independence, nationalism. Queenston Heights was the crucible, reminding both nations that war is never swift. War is never simple, and war demands more than flags, more than faith. It demands unity, readiness, muscle, and the grit to rebuild after each failure. And so the ridge stands, unchanging, witness to smoke, to blood, to heroism, to failure. In the battle's silence there is memory. It is quiet, but it speaks. And we listen because the promise of war is never sweet. It is a promise paid in blood and lumps. And those who cross its line, whether on heights or waves, will come to know that truth sooner or later. Chapter 10. Naval Sparks. The USS Constitution versus HMS Guerriere. The roar of the cannon, the sharp crack of musket fire, the salt spray, stinging eyes, and the creak of timber under relentless assault. On a late summer day in August 1812, far from the bitter shores where armies faltered, a battle at sea would ignite a new chapter in the young United States' struggle for respect. The USS Constitution, a majestic frigate crafted from American oak and ambition, squared off against the British HMS Guerriere, a duel that would echo through history as proof that America, though new and still untested, could challenge the greatest naval power on the planet. The seas had long been a place where Britain ruled supreme. Its Royal Navy was the largest, the most experienced, and arguably the most feared maritime force the world had ever seen. For decades, British ships had patrolled the oceans, asserting control over trade routes, blockading enemies, and projecting the power of an empire that spanned continents. The United States, by contrast, was a fledgling nation with a modest navy and ambitions that far outstripped its resources. Its ships were fewer, smaller, often outgunned. And yet by 1812 the very idea of American naval prowess began to stir, fueled by the seething anger at British interference, impressment, and the growing call to defend national honor. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides by her crew, was a symbol of American resilience and ingenuity. Built with thick, resilient live oak timbers, she seemed impervious to enemy fire. Her decks were manned by a crew hardened by experience and a fierce belief that they could hold their own against any foe. Captain Isaac Hull commanded her with steady resolve, a man who knew the stakes were high but trusted in the skill and spirit of his men. On August 19, 1812, off the coast of Nova Scotia near Boston, the USS Constitution spotted the HMS Guerrière. The British frigate, once a fine ship but now worn and weathered by years of service, was on patrol. Captain James Dacres was in command, an officer seasoned by years of naval warfare, confident that his ship could deal swiftly with the American vessel. The two ships maneuvered, the wind and waves their silent partners and enemies. Both captains knew that victory hinged not only on firepower, but on cunning, timing, and seamanship. The sea was a vast battlefield, unforgiving and unpredictable. The guns roared, the decks shook, and the smoke thickened as broadsides were exchanged. Atiho. First, the battle seemed even, with both sides firing volleys, their cannonballs splintering wood and shattering rigging. But the Constitution's sturdier hull absorbed much of the damage, and the American crew's disciplined gunnery began to tell. With every thunderous blast, the Guerrière's masts and sails tore, her crew thrown into chaos. Captain Hull seized the moment. Ordering a bold maneuver, he brought the Constitution alongside the Guerrière, ready to unleash devastating close-range fire. The American guns tore through the British frigate's hull, and when the Guerrière's mizzenmast collapsed, it was clear the tide had turned. The British ship, crippled and unable to continue the fight, surrendered. The Constitution had triumphed, delivering a blow not only to a single enemy vessel, but to the image of British naval invincibility. News of the victory spread quickly. Across the young nation, citizens greeted the news with jubilation. Newspapers celebrated the Old Ironsides and her crew as heroes, symbols of American courage and determination. For a country that had suffered early setbacks on land, the triumph at sea was a much-needed boost to morale and national pride. But this victory was more than a mere battle won. It was a declaration that the United States was no longer a passive player on the global stage. With grit, skill, and resolve, American sailors could challenge the might of the British Empire on its own terms. The battle also signaled a shift in naval warfare. It demonstrated the importance of well-built ships, disciplined crews, and daring leadership. The Constitution's victory inspired further investment in the U.S. Navy and encouraged other ships to engage British vessels with newfound confidence. Yet, the success came with cost. The sea is unforgiving, and victory here meant lives lost, injuries sustained, and hardships endured. Sailors on both sides faced the brutal reality of naval combat, the deafening noise, the choking smoke, the fear that every moment might be their last. Families back home waited anxiously, unaware if their loved ones would return. As the war continued, the USS Constitution would fight more battles, and other American ships would join the fray, each victory chipping away at British dominance. The naval sparks ignited in 1812 would blaze through the conflict, proving that even a young nation could hold its own against the world's greatest power. The duel between the Constitution and the Guerrière remains etched in history, not simply for the guns fired or the ship surrendered, but for what it represented: a nation asserting its right to exist, to defend its sovereignty, and to command respect on the world stage. This battle at sea was a testament to the spirit of the American people, unbowed, determined, and willing to fight for their place in history. It was a spark that lit the path toward a future where the United States would rise, not just as a landlocked republic, but as a force upon the waves shaping the course of nations to come. Chapter 11. The Frontier War Begins. Tecumseh's Confederacy. In the vast untamed wilderness stretching westward from the edges of the young American Republic, a different kind of war was taking shape. It was not merely a conflict of nations, but a struggle for survival, identity, and sovereignty. a clash that would mark the very soul of the continent. At its center stood Tecumseh, a leader whose vision transcended tribal boundaries and whose determination would ignite the fires of resistance across the frontier. Tecumseh was not just a chief, he was a force of nature. Born into the Shawnee tribe, his presence commanded attention, tall, charismatic, and fierce. He spoke with a voice that carried the weight of generations, yet kindled hope for a future where native peoples could stand, united against the relentless tide of American expansion. To Tecumseh, the scattered tribes of the Ohio Valley, Indiana, and beyond were not isolated groups but threads in a single tapestry, a confederacy that could resist the encroaching settlers who threatened their land, their culture, and their very existence. For decades, the native peoples had watched as settlers pushed westward, claiming lands that had been theirs for centuries. Treaties were signed, often under duress or deceit, and borders shifted like sand beneath their feet. The promises of peace rang hollow as forts rose, roads were built, and new communities sprang up where once dense forests and open plains had flourished. The frontier was no longer a distant boundary, it was a battleground. The British, still nursing their wounds from the American Revolution and embroiled in a global war with Napoleonic France, recognized an opportunity in this unrest. In the dark woods and along the rivers of the Northwest Territory, British agents moved cautiously, offering weapons, supplies, and encouragement to those who would resist American forces. Their goal was clear: to hold the Americans at bay, to protect their own interests in Canada, and to maintain influence in a region that remained contested and volatile. Tecumseh's Confederacy emerged in this crucible of tension. Unlike many leaders before him, Tecumseh sought to bridge the divides between tribes, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Kickapoo, and others, who had often found themselves at odds with one another. His message was one of unity, that survival depended on collective strength, on standing together to protect the land from the settlers' relentless advance. Traveling tirelessly across the frontier, Tecumseh's speeches were marked by passionate appeals to honor, tradition, and the urgency of the moment. "Brothers," he would say, "the white man is like the locust, devouring everything in his path. But if we stand together, we can halt this destruction." His charisma drew crowds, inspiring warriors and elders alike. In council fires and longhouses, he urged a rejection of treaties that ceded land and warned against surrender. His brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, lent spiritual power to this cause, preaching a return to old ways, rejecting the influence of white settlers and their customs. Tenskwatawa's visions and fiery sermons bolstered the Confederacy's resolve, framing their struggle as not only political but sacred. Yet, unity was difficult to achieve. Tribal loyalties ran deep, and centuries of intertribal conflict had left scars. Many leaders doubted the wisdom of confronting a nation as vast and powerful as the United States. Still, Tecumseh's unwavering commitment and magnetic leadership kept the fragile coalition intact. The outbreak of the War of 1812 only intensified these tensions. American settlers in the frontier regions lived in constant fear of raids, attacks, and reprisals. Forts dotted the landscape, symbols of both protection and provocation. When violence erupted, it was brutal and personal. Families were torn from their homes, fields burned, and lives lost on both sides. Tecumseh's alliance with the British was born of necessity. The Crown supplied weapons, ammunition, and support, recognizing that native resistance was a crucial element in their broader strategy against the United States. British officers worked alongside native warriors, sharing intelligence and coordinating efforts to resist American incursions. One of the defining moments came in the battles around the Detroit frontier, where Tecumseh's forces played a decisive role. His leadership was instrumental in the surrender of American General William Hull in August 1812, a stunning blow to U.S. ambitions and a testament to the effectiveness of native and British collaboration. But Tecumseh's vision extended beyond mere military alliance. He understood that without unity, native peoples would remain vulnerable to division and conquest. He dreamed of a confederation that could one day negotiate on equal terms, preserve their lands, and maintain their cultures in the face of an expanding republic. Tragically, this dream would be cut short. In 1813, Tecumseh was killed in battle at the Thames River, a loss that shattered the Confederacy and weakened native resistance. Yet his legacy endured, etched into the history of the continent as a symbol of defiance, courage, and the enduring fight for justice. The Frontier War was not just a peripheral skirmish, but a fundamental clash between two worlds. It revealed the complexities of identity, sovereignty, and survival in a rapidly changing America. It was a war fought in forests and villages, by warriors wielding muskets and traditional weapons, fueled by desperation and hope alike. As the War of 1812 raged on, the struggles of Tecumseh's Confederacy illuminated the broader stakes. How the fate of native peoples was inextricably tied to the outcome of this conflict. Their resistance challenged the American vision of manifest destiny, reminding all that the frontier was not empty land, but home to communities determined to defend their way of life. In the echoes of gunfire and council fires, the story of Tecumseh's Confederacy remains a poignant chapter, one of unity and loss, courage and tragedy, and a reminder that the Frontier War was as much about people and identity as it was about borders and armies. Chapter 12. Turning Tides on the Lakes, Battle of Lake Erie. Darkness still clung to the horizon above Lake Erie on the morning of September 10, 1813, yet beneath its surface, currents of fate were shifting. This vast expanse of water, once a lifeline for trade and travel, had become the battleground upon which the future of the Northwest Territory would be decided. Against the backdrop of forests and farmsteads, beneath the same skies that had witnessed early American losses, a new chapter in the War of 1812 would unfold, a chapter written in oak and iron, courage and command, and led by a man whose resolve would echo through time, Oliver Hazard Perry. Perry was not a seasoned naval hero. At 30, he was youthful and resolute, his ambitions shaped by service in the Quasi-War and the Barbary Wars. Assigned to build and command a fleet on Lake Erie, he faced a Herculean task. The Royal Navy's Canadian squadron, stronger and more seasoned, threatened to dominate the lake, and with it the lifeline of American forces in the West. Supply lines to forts in Detroit and the frontier settlements hinged upon control of these waters. Perry had to act, and fast. The Americans scrambled to assemble their vessels, brigs, schooners, and gunboats built from timbers hewn from Ohio, forests. Shipwrights labored under the summer sun, driven by the hope that these new vessels would tilt the balance in America's favor. Perry oversaw every plank and sail, his presence at the shipyard a testament to his sense of responsibility. To him, failure at sea would doom the army on land. Success, he believed, could redeem Detroit and resound along the frontier. "Don't give up the ship," he would later say, borrowing the motto of a fallen comrade. Opposite him, the British squadron lay in wait at Amherstburg. Their ships were larger, more armed, and commanded by experienced captains who had patrolled Atlantic waters. Yet they were anchored defensively and ill-prepared for the aggression Perry would unleash. When in late August the American fleet moved out, a confrontation loomed inevitable. On that September morning, the lake was deceptively calm. Mist curled above the water, concealing outlines of vessels. Flags snapped faintly in the breeze. Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, led the line, its crew poised. He had ordered his men to prepare for close combat, for long-range encounters would favor the British. The lake would determine their tactics and their fate. The guns thundered. Just after noon, 18-pounder cannonballs tore into rigging and splintered wood as schooners and brigs closed the distance. American sailors returned fire. Cannon smoke curled skyward, obscuring the horizon. Each volley carried risk. British fire cut deep into the Lawrence's deck. Men fell, blood pooling on planks. Perry himself was wounded, shrapnel tearing through his shoulder. Yet, amid the smoke and chaos, his voice rang out, "Don't give up the ship." When the Lawrence was too damaged to continue, Perry transferred to his relief ship, the Niagara. Rowing through choppy waters under enemy fire, a feat of seamanship and courage rare in combat. On the Niagara's deck, his youth transformed. Into resolve, he signaled his fleet, Turn ship and engage the enemy. The pivot was swift. With renewed vigor, American guns roared again, focusing on the British flagship, the Detroit. Rudder shot away, hull ablaze, the Detroit lay dead in the water. Another British vessel faltered. Slowly, unmistakably, the tide turned. Minutes later, the British struck their colors. A salvo of cheers broke from American decks. The lake belonged to the United States. Perry, though wounded, rowed back to the Lawrence's deck to send his famous dispatch. "We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." It was not only a message of victory, it was a declaration that the strategic course of North America had shifted. The consequences were immediate. With control of Lake Erie, American forces were freed to move supplies and troops across the water, cutting off British support to native allies and stranding General Proctor's forces in Canada. The Americans advanced into Upper Canada, leading to the Battle of the Thames and the loss of Tecumseh, fracturing native resistance. But beyond the battlefields, the victory won hearts. Americans rallied, belief renewed. Newspapers proclaimed Perry a hero. Shipyards shone with new building efforts. Across the frontier, settlers felt safer. Soldiers renewed their resolve. Confidence radiated from the lake shore to the Mississippi. Yet, victory at Erie came at a price. Nearly 80 American lives were lost, many more wounded. Families received letters littered with loss and pride. Perry's wounded arm told a story of sacrifice, a necessary cost of commanding a nation's destiny. Historically, the Battle of Lake Erie stands as a turning point. It secured American control of the Northwest, shattered British naval dominance on inland waters, and proved that the United States, though young, could field effective naval power. More than military fact, it was national affirmation, a testament to resolve, craftsmanship, and leadership. The waters of Erie, often calm, hold beneath their waves the memory of that day: smoke, thunder, courage, and command. They remind us that history can shift upon small vessels in open water, where hearts decide more than empires. Perry's victory was not just for him or his fleet. It was for a nation learning to defend itself, frame its identity, believe in its promise. So the lake, that September day, became ground sacred to American memory. A turning tide, sealing a moment when a fledgling republic faced its greatest seaborne challenge and answered it with determination, resilience, and unity. Lake Erie was won. The frontier was safe. The path forward had been carved on water, on land, and in the hearts of a rising nation. Chapter 13. Tecumseh's Death and the Battle of the Thames. The morning mist swirled over the Thames River in October 1813, softening the horizon like a painting about to be revealed. But beneath that fragile veil lay a storm of violence and destiny. This day would not be another clash of arms. It would be a culmination, a reckoning that would echo across the old forests of native resistance. It was here, amid timber and tradition, that Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who had bound tribes into a confederacy and stood as a bulwark against American expansion, would fall. His death would shatter the hope of united indigenous resistance and shift the momentum of the War of 1812. In the days before the battle, Major General William Henry Harrison assembled his forces at the banks of the Thames, hopeful that, with the control of Lake Erie secured, British and native forces in Upper Canada could be cornered. Around that same time, Tecumseh rallied what remained of his confederation: Shawnee, Potawatomi, Odawa, Chippewa, Wyandot, calling them to stand firm. He spoke with urgency. Settlers would be uprooted, the forests would remember injustice. This was their homeland. With his brother Tenskwatawa, spiritual fire ignited belief. Across the frost-strewn fields, Tecumseh's voice carried like thunder unity, dignity, destiny. British Major General Henry Proctor, with a mix of regular troops and militia, prepared to meet Harrison. But his British officers were fewer than promised. Some had deserted, reluctant to engage. His native allies looked to Tecumseh for guidance, trusting his vision over British caution. In those uneasy days, only one certainty remained. When the bullets flew, the world would feel what was at stake. On October 5th, Harrison crossed the Thames with 2,000 men. As they hurried through villages and woodlands, local inhabitants fled or hid, bracing against the displacement that came with war. Tecumseh and his warriors prepared defenses, their lines less formal than European hopes, but rooted in forest. Strength, ambush points, concealed positions, fallen logs, patience and nature were their allies. At dawn on October 5th, the battle began. Musket fire sliced through the crisp air, echoing through trees. British and native artillery pounded the American lines. Warriors fought with a ferocity born of survival. Tecumseh moved among them, arrows etched with promise, ready to be loosed, even as he wielded a musket. His presence inspired ferocity. Men breathed deeper, paused in prayer, and brushed aside fear. But Harrison's men advanced relentlessly. They formed ranks, pushing forward. Their bullets tore through native cover. British regulars fell in missteps of coordination. With each volley, momentum shifted. Willow and oak shivered under the weight of battle. Yells of defiance answered with cries of pain. Neither side yielded. Tecumseh fought on, flanking and countering, urging his warriors forward. A bullet struck the ground near him, sending debris into his face. He remained standing, shouting commands. His hands, once skilled in diplomacy, now held an American rifle with resolute purpose. He pushed forward through smoke and blood, determined to rally his followers. But fate turned. An American rifleman, concealed behind a log, fired. The bullet struck Tecumseh in the chest. He staggered, then fell. His body lay against broken wood and fallen leaves. On one last breath, he uttered a prayer for his people. His death was swift, yet its shock reverberated across the battlefield. Many of his warriors paused, disbelief flickering across their faces. Some rallied in anger, others fled. The currents of unity broke. British troops, lacking support and emboldened by retreat, melted away. When the shooting died, Harrison's army advanced across silent ground. Graves marked those who had fallen, British, American, and native alike. The Thames, once serene, carried echoes of loss. Villages burned, families emerged to find home emptied, culture battered. The environment, sacred to many, was altered. New treaties would follow, promises broken and borders redrawn. For Harrison's men, it was a hard-won victory, pride tempered by respect for fallen foes. They had defeated a British force, but more importantly, they had ended Tecumseh's dream. To them, this meant strategic advantage. Control of the Northwest would shift definitively. To native survivors, it meant the collapse of a unified resistance. Without Tecumseh, their solidarity unraveled. British overtures faltered. Now more distant, more detached. The frontier began a dangerous transformation, from contested land to conquered expansion. News of the battle spread. Back to Baltimore, along Appalachian ridges, through emerging towns like Chicago. Americans cheered for Harrison. The Warhawks hailed the victory. Yet there were quieter voices, of grief, of doubt, of fear that knew. Treaties would erode freedoms as surely as sacred trees. Native communities felt the rupture beneath their feet. Some retreated westward, others remained, seeking new ways to survive. Families mourned a leader who had given them hope. For many, the die was cast. The future would require adaptation, treaties, negotiations, or flight. In Canada, the echoes were different. They mourned their British dead. They hailed their native allies as defenders of their land. But they also sensed that the war was tilting, and that victory over North America's confederated defense had altered their sense of neighborly cooperation. Tecumseh's death at the Thames marked a turning point, not merely in military terms, but in the moral bedrock of the nation. It signaled the failure of an indigenous coalition that had dared to stand against America's expansion. It also underscored the tragedy of war. A man of vision felled in pursuit of land, protection, identity. A focus not on lines drawn on maps, but lives broken, voices silenced, people displaced. For Americans, the battle meant opportunity. Safer frontiers, unchallenged settlements, new treaties. But it also meant lost voices, voices of negotiation, of prophecy, of unity that might have enriched the nation's character. In the coming years, as settlements climbed onto native lands and towns spread across forests, the spiritual and political space once held by those who followed Tecumseh would vanish. In the wider arc of the war, the Battle of the Thames loosened the grip of British influence in the northwest. It secured American pathways to victory, but at a cost. And that cost, broken spirits, burned homes, and futures hollowed by grief, would haunt the frontier for generations. Today, on the plains beside the Thames River, markers stand to commemorate the battle. But beyond stone and plaque, the story of Tecumseh's death is carried in oral tradition, in songs passed between generations, in quiet reflections of resilience and loss. The vision of unity, though fleeting, remains a testament to what might have been. Tecumseh fell that autumn day. A dream of united indigenous resistance died with him, but his spirit lives in the courage of resistance, in calls for justice, in the thought that people, when united, can challenge even the mightiest nations. His fall reminds us that power may conquer land, but courage shapes history. At the Thames, the currents flow again, silently but with memory. We listen for, in that silence is the wound of broken promises, of futures foreclosed, and of a world reconfigured forever. Chapter 14, Burning Along the Border, Niagara and York. The early spring sun of 1813 glimmered over the Niagara frontier as American troops advanced into Upper Canada with purpose and expectation. They carried in their hearts the bitter taste of 1812's failures. Detroit lost, Queenston Heights unrealized, hope flagging. Their targets were clear: the forts and farms of Niagara and the capital of Upper Canada, York. What followed would be a campaign marred by fire and fury, actions whose echoes would shape the war's course and forever alter neighborly bonds. By late April, American forces under General Henry Dearborn, supported by Commodore Isaac Chauncey's fleet, sailed from Sackett's Harbor toward York. They moved in the pre-dawn hush of April 27th. Initial resistance was minimal. British troops retreated under pressure, but their departure carried devastation. A massive explosion rippled through the fort's powder magazine. Debris rained down, taking more than 50 American lives, including Brigadier General Zebulon Pike, and leaving over 200 wounded. Amid the smoke and shock, American soldiers surged into York. What began as a military operation soon dissolved into chaos. Discipline broke. Soldiers, embittered from prior losses, looted homes and businesses. Parliament buildings, Government House, and the town's printing press were torched, symbols of British authority reduced to ashes. American commanders framed theater's strategy, but to residents it felt like home invasion, dethronement of dignity. For 6 days the Americans held York. They seized supplies, commandeered ships, and rifled through militia records. Yet when a gale stranded Chauncey's fleet at Sackett's Harbor, they were forced to withdraw on May 8th, leaving a devastated city behind. Across the Niagara River, a parallel operation had struck Niagara-on-the-Lake earlier in May. American forces captured Fort George on May 27th, routing the British and claiming the peninsula as a staging ground. But their victory lacked permanence. British troops and their native allies retreated to fortified positions, leaving Niagara under tenuous control. American commanders believed York's burning would cow Canadian spirit. Instead, it inflamed it. Villages, once still, now brimmed with resentment. Loyalists and indigenous allies who had felt the weight of American brutality turned to fierce opposition. The frontier, they realized, was no longer a contested land. It was a battlefield of emotion and vengeance. Tensions reached their peak in December of that year at Newark, now Niagara-on-the-Lake. American forces, preparing to withdraw, chose destruction over surrender. More than 300 buildings, homes, barns, stores were ordered burned. In bitter winter cold, villagers fled into snow and darkness. Some perished from exposure. Others were left with nothing but memory. The British retaliated quickly and destructively. Under Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, they crossed into New York on December 18th. They captured Fort Niagara, massacred some prisoners, and burned Lewiston and Black Rock, reducing nearly every building to embers. Allied indigenous fighters, stung by suffering, joined the onslaught. Finally, on December 30th, Buffalo was torched. The village's homes, barns, and ships were set ablaze. Only buildings like the stone jail and a widow's quiet home stood firm. Civilians fled in terror, hearts left in soot. This was not Cold War. It was a burning crescendo of civilian suffering and tit-for-tat destruction. Each blaze sparked another. Each retaliation fed more rage. Niagara's frontier became a crucible where neighbors turned on neighbors, rules of war broken in the name of revenge. In later years, Americans claimed that the British burned Washington in 1814 in retribution for York's burning, a grim, cyclical justice. Historians recall Niagara as something darker, civil war by another name, one nation's frontiers turned inside out, lit by torches of retribution. Chapter 14 is a story of tinder and blaze, of soldiers acting out of bitterness, of civilians caught between borders, of war-burning homes more than generals' names. York's burning transformed conquest into cultural desecration. Newark's fate showed how retaliation becomes horror. Buffalo's ashes proved devastation crosses sides. By war's end, both nations found ruin at their feet. They rebuilt. Peace returned. But the scars remained. Canadians remembered York and Newark. Americans remembered Niagara and Buffalo. The frontier held their memories. The war left behind ashes, but also lessons. It showed how civilian lives, once thought separate from war, became its center. It taught that retaliation is a wound that bleeds inward, and it displayed the resilience of people who rebuild amid the ruins, to create lives in the shadows of fire. Yet in the quiet aftermath, Niagara would endure. Its regrowth would be shaped by trauma, but also by hope. From the ashes, peace, but never forgetting. That is the legacy of border burning, not just destruction, but the fragile rebirth that follows, and the cautionary vow that flame is not justice, and victory costs too much. Chapter 15. Chesapeake Raids and Coastal Harassment. The Chesapeake Bay in 1813 was an open wound, a sprawling inlet of commerce and community, but also a gateway for an enemy determined to hurt America where it felt most vulnerable. The British arrived not with armies, but with swift ships and ruthless intent. Their mission was clear: to strike along the eastern seaboard, to stamp the flag of the empire onto American soil, and to show a nation that had declared peace yet prepared for war just how fragile its security truly was. In early spring, the Royal Navy's squadrons slipped into Hampton Roads. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, once content with blockading distant ports, now craved confrontation. He had grown emboldened by past ventures. The Chesapeake was now his stage, and he intended blunt disruption. Towns were no longer off-limits, they were targets. He would burn, loot, and destroy if it brought America to heel. Havre de Grace, on Maryland's northern edge, found itself in the crosshairs. On May 3rd, as mist lingered over the Susquehanna, Royal Marines and seamen swooped in by boat. Militia fires were returned, but only briefly. Buildings were looted, homes set ablaze, civilians fled. Locals recalled the sight of rockets streaking through dawn skies, setting timber and terror aflame. In minutes, a quiet village was turned to ash and memory. By June, Cockburn had shifted south. He descended on Brunswick, Virginia, then on Hampton, which endured naval bombardment and a brutal ground assault. Militia lines collapsed. Houses, taverns, barns, all were torched. Reports spoke of civilian suffering, women assaulted, families tortured. The press condemned the acts. Wounds were raw, and the Chesapeake felt the echo. Americans responded with anger, confusion, and disbelief. How could a navy preoccupied with distant Europe now torment their own coasts so mercilessly? The navy and militia were ill-prepared. Gunboats skirmished ineffectively. Commanders advised evacuation. Pleas rose for reinforcements. The debates in Congress shifted. These were not frontier wars. They were attacks at home. Then came the summer of 1814. Britain, fresh from victory in Europe after Napoleon's abdication, committed more ships and soldiers to America. Cockburn's squadron returned, stronger, more aggressive. Their canvas flags unfurled deep into bay and river. Proclamations invited enslaved people to freedom if they joined the British. Hundreds fled plantations, seeking refuge aboard British ships. They became guides, intelligence sources, marines. The nature of war was evolving, and the Chesapeake became the crucible of liberty as well as destruction. In June, British forces launched assaults up the Rappahannock, the Patuxent, and small coastal creeks. Private homes, ironworks, and shipyards were systematically razed. Fires spread along the riverside. Commerce was halted. Panic rippled inland. Then, on August 19th, the campaign turned calculated and strategic. British troops landed at Benedict, Maryland, and descended the Patuxent. They cornered and destroyed Commodore Barney's flotilla on the river. From there, they pressed north, toward Washington, D.C., the nation's capital lying vulnerably by the Potomac. The result was terrifying. At Bladensburg, American forces stood and held briefly, but were then routed. The British marched unopposed into Washington. Government buildings were looted and torched. The Capitol, the executive mansion, ambassadors and secretaries fled as flames consumed symbols of nationhood. The Chesapeake, its waters marred by shellfire, its coast lined with destruction, had provided the path to an unprecedented assault on the seat of American government. It showed not only the reach of British naval power, but also the vulnerability that came with rivers and bays tied to political heartbeats. Yet, as the smoke curled skyward from Washington, the Chesapeake proved once again to be a place of resilience. Baltimore fortified. Militia waited. Baltimore's cannons threw bricks into the harbor rivers. When British forces arrived in September, their landing at North Point and bombardment of Fort McHenry met with fierce American resistance. Overnight, rifle fire and cannon light illuminated the harbor, and no one would again say the Chesapeake was undefended. In the aftermath, the Chesapeake raids revealed truths and tensions. They showed how naval power could reach deep into America's veins, how war could no longer obey geographical boundaries. They also ignited a sense of unity and resistance. Privateers arose from Baltimore. Militia drilled under familiar rounds of cannon. Dreams of secession fled under the banner of national protection. An old harbor town like St. Michael's would later claim it fooled the British by hanging lanterns in marshes, drawing ships away from the town itself. Whether true or myth, the legend captured the atmosphere, that the Chesapeake was both battleground and bastion. For hundreds of enslaved people, the raids revealed opportunity as well as horror. The promise of freedom woven into Britain's proclamations gave many courage to escape, an unknown future preferring over continued bondage. The war was swift, violent, disruptive, but in that chaos lives were claimed not only by bullets but by newly found liberty. The Chesapeake campaign, then, was neither a footnote nor a distraction. It was the beating of a war machine against America's home front. It broke hearts and buildings, it shattered illusions. It opened both wounds and ways forward. In the end, peace would return. Washington would be rebuilt. Baltimore would survive. Plantation families would regroup. Yet deep in Chesapeake Marsh, new voices would carry tales of escape. In burned towns, stories of heroism and defiance would shape future generations. View of the nation's character. The Chesapeake raids remain a testament of war's reach, how it consumes not only soldiers, but souls, and how a nation's heart is often measured by the fires it withstands and the unity it rebuilds. Chapter 16. Napoleon's fall frees British forces. The spring of 1814 brought an unexpected calm to Europe, a silence that spoke of empires exhausted and wars too long fought. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the tempest of the continent, had finally fallen. Exiled to Elba, his armies dispersed, and under that stillness lay a transformation in global power projections. For Britain, victory in Europe meant more than peace, it meant opportunity. The troops that had clashed with Napoleon would soon turn their gaze across the Atlantic to a war that had simmered in their absence. Since the dawn of the War of 1812, British forces in North America had been cautious, constrained by commitments in Europe. While the Royal Navy held blockade along the Atlantic, seasoned infantry regiments remained tied to the Peninsular War, wary and distant. But with Napoleon subdued, Britain had no rival demand on its veteran forces. Thousands of soldiers, many hardened in the dust and blood of Spain, became available, ready to serve once more under the Union Jack. By June 1814, a fresh wave of British troops departed Europe. These were not raw recruits but elite regiments, veterans of sieges and leapfrogging battles, disciplined in the tactics of Wellington's army. They sailed to Halifax and Bermuda before being deployed to Canada and sent along North America's coastlines. The goal was clear: to shift from blockade to advance, from defense to offensive, and to bring the full might of the empire to bear on a growing, defiant republic. Their arrival was decisive. On the strategic waterways of the Great Lakes, British-Indian alliance lines stiffened. On the frontier, militia held ground under renewed pressure. On the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coast, squadrons of redcoats and Marines disembarked near river mouths and towns. Even Newfoundland's cold docks brimmed, with ships carrying reinforcements. Within months, the war pressed closer to America's cities. By August, officers like Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross were moving on Washington. Their forces, trained in European siegecraft, easily feinted through militia lines at Bladensburg. With minimal resistance, they stormed into the nation's capital and set fire to the Capitol, White House, and other public buildings, all within 24 hours. Their blazing torches were met with thunder and rain, but the image endured, an empire's power laid bare against a fledgling democracy. It was a dramatic reversal, a foreign army burning the halls of American government. It challenged the illusion of invulnerability. American pride, so hard won on battles like Lake Erie, now quivered under the smoke of Washington's ruins, but it also had unintended consequences. American resolve became sharper, Baltimore fortified, militia trained, and a longing for national unity grew stronger. Meanwhile, British veterans marched along other shores, Champlain, Maine, the Gulf Coast, each in their own right testing America's defenses. Their skill, discipline, and confidence gave them early victories. But they were facing a different America now, one increasingly ready to mobilize, to adapt, and to fight back harder. The redeployment of British forces underscored the war's deeper arc. Once a secondary front to Europe's fires, the War of 1812 had become a primary theater, inviting veteran soldiers. Napoleon's fall had changed everything. It shifted the balance, extended battle lines, and brought battle-hardened troops to test American survival. By fall, with treaties being drafted in Ghent, the war seemed poised for its final act. Britain had brought its best, yet America had discovered its potential. In the years ahead, historians would judge not only battles, but the resilience that emerged from a nation forced to stand on its feet. Napoleon may have fallen, but his shadow had already cast a long war onto the United States. In the silence that followed his defeat, a new intensity rose, one that would decide whether a republic could withstand the full force of empire. Chapter 17. The Burning of Washington, D.C. In the late summer of 1814, the very heart of the United States, the nation's capital, stood on the precipice of destruction. Washington, D.C., a symbol of a young republic's hopes and ambitions, was about to face an assault that would forever mark the War of 1812 in American memory. The burning of Washington was not merely a military event. It was a profound psychological blow, a moment that laid bare the vulnerability of a fledgling nation under siege. The British, freshly reinforced after Napoleon's abdication, had seized the opportunity to strike a powerful symbolic blow. Under the command of Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn, a well-trained, battle-hardened force advanced swiftly through Maryland, their aim clear: to punish the Americans and shake their resolve. The defense of Washington was left to a motley assembly of militia, hastily gathered regulars and exhausted troops, many unprepared for the ferocity of the oncoming storm. On August 24, 1814, the Battle of Bladensburg unfolded. It was a brief, brutal encounter. American forces, disorganized and under-equipped, were overwhelmed. Their lines broke quickly, allowing British troops to march unopposed toward the capital. The retreat of American defenders sent shockwaves through the city. Residents fled, government officials scrambled to protect vital documents, and panic gripped the streets. As British soldiers entered Washington, they moved with a grim determination. Their orders were explicit: to destroy the symbols of American governance. First came the Capitol building, a grand structure still under construction, representing the legislative heart of the Republic. The British set fires that rapidly consumed its wooden interiors. Flames licked at the sky, smoke billowed, and the dome's incomplete skeleton was silhouetted against the burning horizon. Next, the White House, the executive mansion and residence of President James Madison, fell victim to the invaders. Once a proud symbol of American leadership, it was soon engulfed in flames, the windows shattered, walls blackened by smoke. Furniture, artwork, and personal belongings were destroyed or looted. The sight of the president's home in ruins sent a jarring message. No place was safe, no symbol sacred. Throughout the city, other public buildings, Treasury, War Department, Navy Yard, were also targeted. British troops conducted systematic destruction, their torches and powder igniting a wave of devastation that reshaped the physical and emotional landscape of the capital. Yet amid the destruction, some buildings, such as the Patent Office and certain churches, were spared, whether by design or circumstance. The burning of Washington was not merely tactical, it was strategic theater. The British aimed to demoralize, to expose American weakness to both domestic and foreign eyes. In the grand tradition of warfare, they sought to show that the Republic, despite its ideals and declarations, could be humbled. But the American response, both immediate and lasting, was far from defeat. News of the burning galvanized citizens, igniting a surge of patriotism and resilience. The memory of Washington's fiery night became a rallying point, a vivid reminder of what was at stake. Efforts to rebuild began almost immediately, the charred ruins a testament to both vulnerability and determination. In the aftermath, the British forces withdrew, their mission accomplished, but the scars they left ran deep. Washington's destruction reshaped American perceptions of security and identity. It underscored the fragility of the Republic and the fierce need to defend its institutions. This dark night in August became etched in the collective consciousness, a somber chapter in the story of a nation tested by fire. Yet, from those ashes, a renewed spirit emerged. The War of 1812 would continue, but the burning of Washington, D.C. remained a stark reminder that freedom required vigilance, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve. Chapter 18: The Defense of Baltimore and the Star-Spangled Banner. As the smoke from the burning of Washington, D.C. still hung heavy in the air, the British forces turned their sights toward Baltimore, Maryland, an important port city and a symbol of American resilience. The attack on Baltimore in September 1814 would become one of the defining moments of the War of 1812, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the American people and a night that would inspire the creation of a national anthem. Baltimore was a city on edge. The recent devastation of the capital had rattled the nation's confidence, yet Baltimore's citizens and defenders steeled themselves with determination. The city was guarded by a network of forts and batteries, the most critical of which was Fort McHenry, standing sentinel at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. Its strategic position controlled access to the city by sea, making it the gateway that the British had to breach to strike Baltimore itself. The British naval fleet, led by Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, prepared to unleash a bombardment designed to break the fort's defenses and pave the way for a ground assault. Their fleet was formidable, boasting some of the finest ships of the era, including the powerful HMS Erebus and HMS Meteor. Across the harbor, American forces, under the command of Major George Armistead, readied themselves for what would become a fierce and sustained battle. On the night of September 13th, 1814, the British fleet opened fire. The sky above Baltimore was pierced by a storm of mortar shells and rockets, each explosion casting eerie glows and shadows across the waters and the fort's sturdy walls. For 25 hours, the relentless bombardment raged. The air was thick with smoke. The ground shook with each blast, and the defenders faced a ceaseless onslaught that tested their courage and resolve. Inside Fort McHenry, the defenders endured, their spirits unbroken despite the deafening thunder of artillery. Cannons roared back, returning fire with precision and determination. The fort's walls, battered but unyielding, absorbed the British assault. Soldiers and sailors worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded, reloading guns, and holding their positions through the long, harrowing night. Amid this chaos stood Francis Scott Key, a young lawyer and amateur poet who had been detained aboard a British ship. Key had gone to negotiate the release of a prisoner, but found himself unable to leave, trapped on the water with a front-row view of the bombardment. Through the smoke and flashes of light, he watched anxiously, hoping to see the American flag, still flying over Fort McHenry at dawn. As dawn broke on September 14th, Key's eyes were drawn to the fort. There, high above the battered walls, the huge American flag, its stripes and stars vividly illuminated by the morning sun, still waved proudly in the breeze. The sight filled Key with a surge of relief and patriotism. Inspired by the moment, he began to write a poem that would capture the resilience, hope, and defiance of a nation under siege. Key's verses, originally titled Defense of Fort McHenry, soon became known as the Star-Spangled Banner. The poem vividly described the flag's survival against the odds, a powerful symbol of American endurance. Lines like, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light," echoed the triumph of those who stood firm against overwhelming force. The defense of Baltimore was not only a military victory, but a profound moral boost for the United States. The British fleet, unable to breach Fort McHenry's defenses, eventually withdrew, marking a turning point in the war. The city itself was saved from destruction, and the American forces went on the offensive in other theaters, buoyed by the courage displayed at Baltimore. This episode captured the essence of the War of 1812, struggles of survival, fierce determination, and moments of unexpected heroism. The resilience of Fort McHenry and the birth of the Star-Spangled Banner became enduring symbols, echoing through American history as reminders of sacrifice and unity. The war would continue, but on that morning, beneath the rising sun and the waving flag, America found a powerful emblem of identity, one that would inspire generations to come. Chapter 19. Northern Theatre, Battle of Plattsburgh. As the War of 1812 dragged on into its third year, the northern frontier between the United States and British Canada became a pivotal battleground. The vast wilderness of upstate New York, dotted with lakes, rivers, and dense forests, set the stage for a confrontation that would prove decisive, not only for the region, but for the war itself. This was the Battle of Plattsburgh, fought in September 1814, a fierce clash of naval might and land forces that would shape the fate of the Northern Theatre and ultimately the course of the conflict. Plattsburgh, a small town nestled along the western shore of Lake Champlain, sat at the crossroads of invasion routes between Canada and the United States. Controlling this gateway was essential. For the British, victory here promised to open a corridor deep into the American heartland, threatening New York and New England. For the Americans, holding Plattsburgh was a matter of survival, a bulwark against British incursions that could devastate the fledgling nation. The British plan was bold and methodical. Commanded by Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, the British aimed to launch a two-pronged assault, a naval attack on Lake Champlain to secure dominance over the waters, coupled with a land invasion to seize the town itself. Their objective was clear: crush American resistance, break the frontier defenses, and force a favorable end to the war through territorial gains. But standing in their way was an American force under the command of Brigadier General Alexander Macomb on land, and Commodore Thomas MacDonough on the lake. MacDonough, a seasoned naval officer, had prepared meticulously. With a hastily assembled but determined fleet, he positioned his ships strategically in Plattsburgh Bay, ready to challenge the British flotilla and deny them control of Lake Champlain. The late summer sun rose on September 11, 1814. The calm waters of Lake Champlain belied the storm about to break. The British fleet, larger and more heavily armed, advanced into the bay with the intention to crush the American squadron. Cannon smoke would soon cloud the sky. The thunder of artillery and the cries of men would fill the air as both fleets engaged in a desperate close-quarters battle. MacDonough's ships were anchored in a strong defensive line, carefully arranged to maximize firepower and protect vital points. The British vessels moved forward, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. The first shots echoed across the lake, the beginning of a brutal hour-long exchange of fire that tested every ounce of skill, bravery, and resolve. Cannons roared from both sides, sending plumes of smoke and splinters of wood into the air. The battle unfolded with a deadly choreography. Macdonough's flagship, the USS Saratoga, sustained heavy damage, her sails torn and guns silenced by the British barrage. But Macdonough, calm amid the chaos, executed a brilliant maneuver. Using kedge anchors, he skillfully rotated the Saratoga to bring fresh guns into the fight, surprising the British and turning the tide. As the battle wore on, British ships began to falter, their hulls breached, their crews suffering casualties. The Americans, though outgunned, fought with fierce determination, their knowledge of the lake and naval tactics giving them a crucial edge. At last, the British flagship, the Confiance, was badly damaged and forced to surrender, signaling the collapse of British naval power on Lake Champlain. With naval dominance secured, American land forces prepared to meet the British Army, advancing toward Plattsburgh. General Macomb had fortified his positions, utilizing the rugged terrain and hastily constructed defenses to slow the enemy's advance. The British, weary from their naval defeat, launched a series of assaults on American lines, hoping to break through and capture the town, but the Americans held firm. Infantry and militia soldiers, many fighting to defend their homes and families, repelled wave after wave of British attacks. The clash of muskets, the roar of cannon, and the cries of wounded men filled the forests and fields around Plattsburgh. The British, demoralized and overextended, eventually withdrew, their hopes for a northern invasion dashed. The victory at Plattsburgh was a profound and symbolic moment. It shattered British plans to carve a path through the northern states and underscored American resilience. More than that, it boosted morale across the young nation, proving that despite setbacks elsewhere, the United States could stand and fight and win against one of the world's greatest military powers. The battle's impact reached far beyond the shores of Lake Champlain. News of the American victory spread swiftly, influencing diplomatic negotiations underway in Ghent, Belgium. Britain's defeat weakened their bargaining position, nudging both sides closer to peace. The Battle of Plattsburgh was not just a military triumph. It was a decisive factor that helped shape the war's end and the future of the United States. For the men who fought there, on the decks of ships, in the muddy fields, beneath the canopy of trees, the battle was a test of endurance, courage and sacrifice. They faced the horrors of war, the crack of musket fire, the screams of comrades, the shattering explosions of cannonballs. Yet through it all, their commitment to their country and cause remained unbroken. In the grand sweep of the War of 1812, the Battle of Plattsburgh stands as a vivid chapter of perseverance and strategic brilliance. It reminds us how geography, leadership, and the unyielding spirit of ordinary people converged to defend a fragile nation in its hour of need. It tells a story not just of conflict, but of hope. Hope for a future where America's independence and sovereignty would endure. As the smoke cleared over Lake Champlain, the flag of the United States still flew over Plattsburgh, a symbol of victory forged by grit, resolve, and the unwavering will to survive. Chapter 20. Peace Talks in Ghent. Diplomats at Work. As the guns roared across distant battlefields and the smoke of war lingered over the American frontier and the Canadian wilderness, a different kind of struggle was unfolding thousands of miles. Away in the quiet grand halls of Ghent, a city nestled in the heart of Belgium. Here, amid the marble and velvet of European diplomacy, emissaries from the United States and Great Britain faced a daunting task: to end a war that had drained nations, cost thousands of lives, and left deep scars on both sides. The War of 1812, now entering its third brutal year, had become a grinding stalemate. Neither the Americans nor the British could claim a decisive victory. Battles had been fought with valor and ferocity, from the shores of Lake Erie to the burning streets of Washington, D.C. But the tide of conflict had ebbed and flowed without delivering the clear triumph either side sought. The war had become costly. financially, politically, and humanly, and the appetite for peace grew steadily. In August 1814, the United States and Britain sent their chief negotiators to Ghent. For the Americans, a delegation led by John Quincy, Adams, Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin arrived, men of sharp minds and steadfast patriotism, carrying the hopes of a young nation still fighting to secure its place on the world stage. Across the grand table sat the British delegation, including Lord Gambier and Lord Bathurst, representatives of an empire weary from the ceaseless conflicts of the Napoleonic Wars, yet determined to protect its interests and maintain honor. The Tecumseh setting was austere but charged with tension. The ornate chambers echoed with the quiet rustle of papers, the low murmur of discussion, and the weight of unspoken burdens. Here, the clash was no longer of muskets and cannon, but of words, arguments, and delicate compromises. The diplomats faced a complex web of issues: territorial disputes, maritime rights, Native American lands, and questions of national sovereignty. Each side came armed not with soldiers, but with carefully crafted demands and the urgent desire to avoid further bloodshed. The British began with firm positions. They sought to secure their control over Canada and protect their maritime interests, especially the right to impress sailors, seizing men from American ships to serve in the Royal Navy, a practice that had ignited much of the conflict. The Queenston Americans, on the other hand, demanded respect for their sovereignty, an end to impressment, and the restoration of borders to their pre-war status. They also pushed for protections for Native American lands, whose fate had been caught in the crossfire of imperial ambitions and frontier expansion. Yet, as weeks passed, the diplomats discovered that the brutal realities of war and the shifting tides of military fortune had softened their demands. The British naval defeat on Lake Champlain and setbacks in the Northern Theatre had eroded their leverage. The Americans, while proud of their resistance and victories, recognized the limitations of their military reach. The war, costly and exhausting, had taken its toll on both nations. Behind closed doors, debate raged. Tempers flared and cooled, long days and nights stretched into weeks. The negotiators grappled with questions that could shape the future of North America. Could a lasting peace be built on compromise? Was it possible to reconcile the wounds of war without forcing either side into humiliation? How could the rights of native peoples be safeguarded amid these great powers' contest? Among the many voices, John Quincy Adams stood as a steady presence, his keen intellect and diplomatic skill guiding the American delegation. Henry Clay, the fiery orator known as the Great Compromiser, argued passionately for a peace that honored the sacrifices made and ensured the young nation's future. Albert Gallatin, the experienced statesman, worked tirelessly to find common ground. On the British side, their negotiators faced the delicate balance of protecting empire interests while seeking to end a war that had drained resources needed elsewhere. The breakthrough came not through grand gestures, but through quiet pragmatism. Both sides recognized that the best course was a return to the status quo ante bellum, a restoration of conditions to what they were before the war. The thorny issues of impressment and Native American territories for the moment were set aside, left to be addressed through future diplomacy. The principle was simple: peace over continued bloodshed. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. It was a document of compromise, no triumph for either side, but an end to the conflict that had cost so much. The treaty restored borders, called for the release of prisoners, and laid the groundwork for improved relations. News of the treaty, carried across oceans and frontiers, was met with cautious relief by soldiers and civilians alike. Yet the war did not end immediately. Communication was slow, and battles continued in distant places, most famously the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, fought unaware that peace had been declared. The conflict, in many ways, only truly concluded as the treaty's words spread across the Atlantic and into the hearts and minds of the people. The peace talks in Ghent stand as a testament to the power of diplomacy amid the horrors of war. They reveal how, even in the darkest hours, dialogue and reason can prevail over violence and destruction. The treaty did not solve all problems, nor did it erase the sacrifices made on both sides, but it provided a path forward, a fragile peace that would shape the destiny of a continent. For the diplomats who labored through that bitter winter, the Treaty of Ghent was more than a piece of parchment. It was a beacon of hope, a recognition of shared humanity, and a reminder that the future belonged to those willing to talk, listen, and build bridges rather than walls. As the sun set on the war, the treaty marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of rebuilding, reconciliation, and the hard work of forging a lasting peace from the ashes of conflict. The War of 1812, with all its blood and fire, had come to an end, not with a decisive victory, but with the quiet strength of diplomacy and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow. Chapter 21. The Treaty of Ghent, signed but not yet known. On a cold winter's day, December 24, 1814, in the elegant city of Ghent, a treaty was signed that, in theory, ended the War of 1812. The ink dried on parchment, sealing an agreement between two weary nations, the United States and Great Britain, to lay down arms and seek peace. But for the people of America, the news had not yet arrived. The war was officially over, yet the guns still roared, and the lives of countless soldiers and civilians hung in the balance, unaware that the conflict had quietly drawn to a close thousands of miles away. This is a story about the strange lag between peace made and peace felt, a delay shaped by the limits of communication, the vastness of distance, and the urgency of battle. It is a tale of expectation and ignorance, hope and despair, of men fighting and dying, all while the world shifted beneath their feet. In the early 19th century, information traveled slowly, burdened by the speed of horses, ships, and messengers. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on the 24th of December, but it took weeks filled with uncertainty, rumors, and mounting tension, for the news to cross the Atlantic Ocean and reach American shores. For the people back home and the soldiers in the field, the war seemed far from over. On the eastern coast of the United States, the news traveled by ship, buffeted by winter storms and treacherous seas. Harbors and ports buzzed with anxious anticipation, yet no official word came. American commanders, unaware of the treaty, prepared for the continuation of hostilities. This disconnection between diplomatic reality and battlefield action would have profound consequences. Far to the south, in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, General Andrew Jackson and his ragtag army of militia, free men of color, Native American, allies and regular soldiers were assembling to defend New Orleans from an approaching British force. The stakes were high. Control of the Mississippi River and the gateway to the vast American interior hung in the balance. Yet Jackson's defenders were unaware that peace had been agreed upon in Europe. For them, every shot fired, every cannonball launched was a fight for survival and for the young nation's honor. Meanwhile, on the northern frontier, skirmishes and battles continued. British and American soldiers clashed along the rugged border between the United States and Canada. Families in small towns lived with the constant fear of raids and reprisals. Messages carried by riders and ships were slow, sometimes intercepted, or delayed. The war seemed endless, its brutal momentum unbroken by the fragile peace being shaped in Ghent. The treaty itself was a document of compromise. It called for the return of conquered territories to their pre-war owners, the release of prisoners, and the resumption of friendly relations. Notably, it made no mention of the thorny issue of impressment, the practice of forcibly recruiting sailors into the British Navy, which had been a central cause of the war. That problem had largely faded in importance with the end of the Napoleonic wars in Europe. Nor did it address the fate of Native American lands in any lasting way, leaving many indigenous peoples to face the consequences without a clear protector. As diplomats in Ghent laid down their pens, sealing a treaty born of exhaustion and pragmatism, the real war, the war of flesh and blood, of muskets and bayonets, was still being fought. News would not arrive in time to prevent the bloodshed at New Orleans, where one of the most decisive battles of the entire war took place on January 8, 1815. In that fight, General Jackson's forces would deliver a crushing defeat to the British, a victory that galvanized American pride and identity. But this victory, glorious and celebrated, was fought after the war had officially ended. The Treaty of Ghent, though signed, was not yet known. It was a reminder of how human lives and the tides of war do not always align neatly with the signatures on a page or the proclamations of governments. Across the nation, families waited anxiously. Soldiers on the frontier held their positions, unsure when the fighting would end. Townspeople wondered what the future held, what the costs of this bloody conflict would be, and whether peace was finally within reach. When the news finally arrived, months later, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. The war was over. The sacrifices, the suffering, and the struggles had culminated in a peace that, while imperfect, allowed the United States to continue its journey as a sovereign nation. The Treaty of Ghent did not solve every problem, nor did it erase the scars left by years of conflict. But it marked a turning point, a moment when diplomacy, however delayed, overcame the chaos of war. This chapter of history teaches us about the power and limits of communication in times of conflict. It reveals how war can outpace peace, how battles can rage on even after leaders have agreed to stop fighting, and it reminds us that behind every treaty, every political decision, are real people, soldiers, families, civilians, waiting in hope and uncertainty for the promise of peace to reach them at last. Chapter 22, The Battle of New Orleans, Jackson's Miracle. The morning of January 8, 1815, dawned cold and misty over the wetlands surrounding New Orleans. A dense fog clung to the swampy banks of the Mississippi River, hiding the movements of a British force that had crossed the sea to strike at the heart of America's southern frontier. They came with thousands of battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, confident in their ability to capture this vital port city, a gateway to the vast interior of the young nation. But waiting for them on the American side stood a man and an army unlike any the British had faced before, General Andrew Jackson, a rugged and determined commander with a ragtag force of militia, free African Americans, native allies, pirates, and regular soldiers. These men had little in common, save for a fierce will to defend their home. Against overwhelming odds, they were ready to turn back the British invasion. What followed was a battle that would become legendary, not simply because of its ferocity or scale, but because of the timing and the stakes. Unknown to both sides, peace had already been agreed upon in Ghent, thousands of miles away. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed weeks earlier, officially ending the war, yet this vital news had not reached America. The guns had not fallen silent. The blood of hundreds would be spilled on this swampy battlefield, in a fight that history would remember as a miracle. General Jackson's preparations were meticulous. Understanding the terrain better than his enemy, he ordered his men to build earthworks, improvised fortifications that would shelter his troops and channel the British into deadly crossfire. His forces numbered around 4,500 men, outnumbered by the 8,000 British soldiers poised to attack. The disparity in numbers, however, belied the determination and ingenuity of Jackson's army. As the British troops advanced in the early morning hours, their movements masked by fog and confusion, they encountered fierce resistance. Musket volleys and cannon fire tore through their ranks. The British tried repeatedly to scale the American defenses, but each assault was met with withering fire. The muddy ground, the tangled swamps, and the steely resolve of Jackson's men turned the battlefield into a deadly trap. The battle raged for hours. British officers fell, soldiers were mowed down by musket balls, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the misty landscape. Jackson's men, despite their varied backgrounds and limited training, fought with a discipline and courage born of desperation and hope. They held the line against wave after wave of attacks, inflicting severe casualties on the British, who were unprepared for such tenacity. Amid the chaos, Jackson emerged as a commanding figure, inspiring his troops with his presence and unwavering resolve. His leadership was decisive, his orders clear and urgent. He knew that if New Orleans fell, the entire Mississippi Valley might be lost, and with it, the hopes of a growing nation. He fought not just for territory, but for the very future of the United States. When the smoke finally cleared, the British were forced to retreat. The Americans had won a stunning, resounding victory. British casualties numbered over 2,000 dead and wounded. American losses were comparatively light, numbering around 70 dead. The disparity was staggering, a testament to the effective defense mounted by Jackson and his men. News of the victory spread quickly across the United States, igniting a wave of patriotic pride and celebration. The Battle of New Orleans became a symbol of American resilience and determination, a story of how a diverse, improvised force could defeat the might of the British Empire against all odds. Yet the victory carried an irony that few fully grasped at the time. The war was technically over. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed before the battle even began. If only news had traveled faster, the bloodshed might have been avoided. But, in the face of uncertainty, men had fought with everything they had, shaping the narrative of a nation's identity in the process. Andrew Jackson emerged from the battle a national hero. His leadership at New Orleans catapulted him to fame and set the stage for his future role as one of America's most influential and controversial presidents. The victory gave Americans a renewed sense of confidence and unity after years of conflict and hardship. More than a military triumph, the Battle of New Orleans was a defining moment in the War of 1812 and in the story of the United States itself. It demonstrated the country's capacity to defend itself, to endure, and to emerge stronger from adversity. It forged a legacy of courage, sacrifice, and tenacity, a legacy that would echo through generations. In the quiet swamps and fields where so many had fought and fallen, the nation's future was being written, not with ink, but with blood and grit, with hope and determination. The Battle of New Orleans was, in every sense, America's miracle. Chapter 23. The Hero Emerges. Rise of Andrew Jackson. In the wake of the Battle of New Orleans, as the smoke settled and the nation caught its breath, one figure stood unmistakably at the center of the American story, a man whose fierce determination and unyielding spirit had become a beacon of hope and pride for a young republic. Andrew Jackson, the general who had defied the odds and crushed the British invasion, emerged not just as a military victor, but as a symbol of America's resilience and promise. Jackson's rise was meteoric. Before the war, he was a frontier lawyer and a judge in Tennessee, known for his rugged demeanor and uncompromising sense of justice. Yet he was far from a polished politician or a member of the Eastern elite. He was a man of the frontier, rough, bold, and shaped by the harsh realities of life on the edge of the expanding nation. His life was marked by personal hardship, duels, and battles, not only on the field but in the courtroom and in the hearts of his people. The War of 1812 changed everything. His leadership during the conflict transformed him from a regional figure into a national icon. At New Orleans, he had done what many believed impossible. He had united a disparate group of fighters, militia, Native Americans, freedmen, and even privateers, into an effective force that stood firm against the British Empire. His victory was more than tactical. It was symbolic. It was a declaration that America, though young and untested, could defend itself with courage and resolve. The public celebrated Jackson with fervor. Newspapers hailed him as the hero of New Orleans, and his fame spread far beyond the southern states. He became the embodiment of the American spirit, a rugged individualist who embodied the ideals of bravery, independence, and relentless perseverance. Stories of his exploits circulated widely, stirring pride and inspiring countless citizens. But Jackson's rise was not without controversy. His fierce temperament and aggressive style made him a polarizing figure. He was admired by many for his strength, but also feared for his willingness to take bold, sometimes ruthless actions. In battle, he was relentless. In politics, he would prove equally formidable. His victories on the battlefield gave him a platform, but it was his ability to connect with the common man that ensured his lasting appeal. The War of 1812 had revealed deep divisions in American society between the established elites of the East and the frontier settlers of the West and South. Jackson, with his humble origins and no-nonsense approach, came to symbolize the rising power of the common man. He was a voice for those who felt overlooked by the traditional centers of power, and he would harness this support in the years to come. In the years following the war, Jackson parlayed his military fame into a political career. He served as a U.S. Senator and Governor of Florida, a territory recently acquired from Spain. His leadership in Florida, particularly his efforts to suppress Native American resistance and maintain order, further cemented his reputation as a decisive and forceful leader. His presidency, which began in 1829, would be defined by the same traits that made him a war hero: determination, a fierce belief in the Union, and a commitment to expanding democracy, at least for white male citizens. Jackson's policies were shaped by his vision of a strong, united America, and he was unafraid to confront what he saw as entrenched interests, including the powerful Second Bank of the United States. Jackson's rise also marked a shift in American politics. He was the first president from the West, and his election represented the growing influence of frontier states in national affairs. His approach to leadership, direct, sometimes confrontational, always resolute, set the tone for a new era in American governance. He was both celebrated and reviled, a man who inspired loyalty and provoked fierce opposition. His impact on the nation was profound. Under Jackson's leadership, the United States expanded its borders and strengthened its federal government. He championed the idea that government should serve the people, not the privileged few. Yet his legacy is complex. While he promoted greater participation in politics for many, his policies toward Native Americans, most notably the Indian Removal Act, would lead to suffering and displacement on an enormous scale. Despite the controversies, Jackson's status as a war hero remained central to his identity. His victory at New Orleans was remembered as a defining moment not only in the War of 1812, but in the making of the United States. It was a victory that helped forge a sense of national pride and unity at a time when the young country was still finding its way. The story of Andrew Jackson is in many ways the story of America itself, a tale of ambition, conflict, triumph, and contradiction. From the battlefields of New Orleans to the halls of the White House, Jackson's life reflected the tumultuous growth of a nation determined to define its character and its destiny. As the War of 1812 faded into history, Andrew Jackson's star continued to rise. He would become one of the most influential and controversial figures of the early 19th century, a man whose legacy would shape the course of American history long after the cannons fell silent. In the hearts and minds of many Americans, he was the living embodiment of their hopes, their struggles, and their enduring belief in the promise of a nation forged in conflict and bound by determination. Jackson's rise from frontier soldier to national hero and president captures the spirit of a country in transition. His story reminds us that history is shaped not only by events and battles, but by the people who rise to meet their moment, flawed, passionate, and unforgettable. Chapter 24. Winners, Losers, and Forgotten Voices. The War of 1812 came to an end with a treaty signed, guns silenced, and borders left largely unchanged. Yet beneath the quiet surface of diplomatic papers and official proclamations, the consequences rippled deeply through the lives of nations and peoples, some triumphant, others defeated, and many left forgotten in the grand sweep of history. For Britain, the war was, in many respects, a sideshow, a distant conflict overshadowed by the colossal struggle against Napoleonic France. When Napoleon fell in 1814, Britain was finally able to redirect attention and resources to the American front. But even then, the war remained a secondary concern. Britain's primary goal was to defend its Canadian territories and maintain its global empire. The British victory at battles like Queenston Heights and the burning of Washington demonstrated their resolve and military might, but the Treaty of Ghent restored the status quo ante bellum, returning boundaries to their pre-war lines. In Britain, the war stirred little enthusiasm. It was a costly conflict with uncertain gains. British society moved on quickly, focused on post-Napoleonic reconstruction and expanding influence elsewhere. Yet for the British military, the war offered valuable lessons in logistics, naval warfare, and colonial defense, lessons that would shape future engagements across the empire. The victory, or rather the survival, of Canada remained a point of pride for Britain and its loyalists, Canada, however, told a different story, a story of survival and identity forged in the crucible of war. For Canadian settlers and British loyalists, the War of 1812 was a defining moment. Against formidable odds, they had withstood multiple invasions, rallied militia and Indigenous allies, and defended their homes with tenacity and courage. The battles fought along the Niagara frontier at Queenston Heights, and throughout Upper and Lower Canada, stirred a sense of unity and emerging nationalism. In the aftermath, the war became a foundational myth for Canada, a symbol of resistance against American expansionism. The memory of shared sacrifice and victory helped bind diverse communities and set the stage for a distinct Canadian identity, separate from both Britain and the United States. But this sense of triumph masked deeper tensions between English and French Canadians, between settlers and Indigenous peoples, and between colonial authorities and local interests. The war had united them temporarily, but the challenges of nation-building remained. For the United States, the war was both a test and a turning point. The young republic, barely 3 decades old, had faced the mighty British Empire and survived. The conflict revealed profound weaknesses, military unpreparedness, political division, and economic disruption. Yet, it also revealed strengths, resilience, resourcefulness, and a growing sense of national pride. The stunning victory at New Orleans, although occurring after the treaty was signed, became a powerful symbol of American courage and tenacity. Andrew Jackson emerged as a national hero, embodying the spirit of a people determined to defend their sovereignty. The war fostered a surge of patriotism, a feeling that America had truly come of age on the world stage. However, the war's legacy for the United States was complex. The conflict intensified sectional tensions and raised questions about the role of the federal government in defense and economic development. It accelerated westward expansion, often at the expense of Native American nations. And it left scars, both physical and psychological, that would influence the country's politics and policies for decades. Yet, amidst the narratives of national pride and military valor, there are voices often overlooked, those of the Native American tribes caught in the crossfire of empire and expansion. For Indigenous peoples, the War of 1812 was not a contest between Britain and the United States alone. It was a struggle for survival, sovereignty, and the preservation of their homelands. Tecumseh's Confederacy, a coalition of tribes united in resistance, represented a powerful vision of Indigenous self-determination. Tecumseh himself was a charismatic leader whose death at the Battle of the Thames dealt a devastating blow to native resistance. But the war's end marked not peace for Indigenous nations. It marked a beginning of further displacement, broken treaties, and loss of land. The treaty negotiations in Ghent ignored the fate of native peoples almost entirely. Neither Britain nor the United States sought to secure protections for Indigenous nations. The British, once allies and protectors of many tribes, retreated from this role, leaving Native Americans vulnerable to American expansionism. In the years that followed, Indigenous communities faced forced removals, cultural erasure, and violent conflicts. The story of the War of 1812, therefore, is not merely one of nations clashing on land and sea, but of peoples caught in the tides of empire and change. It is a story of winners and losers, yes, but also of the forgotten voices whose lands were contested and whose futures were altered forever. As historians and storytellers, it is our duty to remember this complexity, to honor the valor of soldiers and civilians on all sides, to acknowledge the pain and resilience of Indigenous communities, to recognize that the end of the war did not mean the end of conflict or struggle for many. In the final reckoning, the War of 1812 shaped the destinies of Britain, Canada, the United States, and native nations in profound ways. It helped define borders and identities. It forged heroes and legends. It left scars that would echo through generations. And yet, beyond the treaties and the battles, it was above all a human story, a story of courage and loss, of hope and hardship, of nations and peoples striving to find their place in a rapidly changing world. The echoes of 1812 continue to resonate, reminding us that history is never simple and that the voices of the past, winners, losers, and the forgotten alike, deserve to be heard. Chapter 25. The long-term impact on American identity. The War of 1812 was in many ways a crucible, a trial by fire that tested the young American nation's resolve, character, and vision for itself. Though often overshadowed in history by the Revolutionary War before it, or the Civil War decades later, this conflict carved deep and lasting marks on the identity of the United States. It was a war that kindled the fires of nationalism, ignited industrial ambition, and instilled a confidence in the nation's military and its place on the world stage. When the last shots were fired and the Treaty of Ghent was signed, restoring peace but not altering borders, something profound had already begun to change in the American consciousness. The experience of standing toe-to-toe with the British Empire, one of the world's most formidable powers, without being swallowed. Hull was no small feat. It was a validation, a declaration that the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a country that could defend itself, that could face adversity with determination and emerge with its dignity intact. The war, despite its mixed military results and enormous hardships, was remembered by many Americans as a second war of independence. This was not just a phrase, but a sentiment deeply felt. The British had tried time and again to intimidate, to restrict, and to control. They had blockaded American ports, interfered with trade, impressed sailors, and ignited conflicts on the frontier. Yet, at war's end, the United States stood firm. The Republic had survived. Its flag still waved freely. This victory, whether in fact decisive or more symbolic, became the cornerstone of a burgeoning nationalism. Patriotism surged. Across cities and countryside, the stories of battles like New Orleans and heroes like Andrew Jackson inspired a new pride. Citizens who had once doubted the young nation's staying power now believed in its promise. The war created a shared narrative of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience that helped unify a diverse and expanding population. But nationalism was only part of the legacy. The war exposed serious vulnerabilities in America's economy and infrastructure, prompting urgent efforts to strengthen and modernize. During the conflict, the British blockade strangled American trade and cut off vital supplies. The fragile manufacturing base could not meet wartime demands, and the young nation faced shortages of weapons, uniforms, and other essentials. In response, Americans began to look inward, to their own resources, industries, and ingenuity. The war became a catalyst for the growth of American industry. Factories sprang up to produce textiles, firearms, and shipbuilding materials. The experience demonstrated the need for a stronger industrial base that would reduce dependence on foreign goods and make the nation more self-reliant. This shift had profound long-term effects. The years after the war saw an era of rapid industrial expansion known as the American system. Politicians like Henry Clay championed policies to support internal improvements, roads, canals, and infrastructure that would bind the country together economically and geographically. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was a shining example of this vision, opening new markets and fueling westward growth. The war also prompted reforms in the American military. The inadequacies revealed during the conflict, poor training, lack of coordination, and insufficient numbers were painfully clear. In its wake, the United States began to build a more professional and capable army and navy. The lessons learned at sea, where American frigates won hard-fought victories against British ships, demonstrated the importance of a strong naval presence. The Navy was expanded and modernized, and new naval academies were established. On land, militias were reorganized, and the concept of a standing army gained wider acceptance. The war had shown that relying solely on part-time citizen soldiers was insufficient against a professional foe. Confidence in American arms grew, but so did a sober awareness of the need for preparation and readiness. This foundation would serve the nation in conflicts to come. The impact of the war extended beyond borders and battlefields. It reshaped American culture and politics. The Democratic-Republican Party, dominant during the war, embraced the ideals of self-sufficiency and national pride. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and even discussed secession at the Hartford Convention, faded into political obscurity, seen by many as unpatriotic. The era of good feelings that followed the war was marked by a relative political unity, at least for a time, and a focus on national growth. Meanwhile, the frontier continued to expand. The war's aftermath removed many Native American allies of the British and shattered much of their resistance. This opened vast, new territories to American settlers. The nation's push westward, fueled by the belief in manifest destiny, was emboldened by the war's outcome. However, this expansion came at a tragic cost to indigenous peoples, whose lands and cultures were further displaced and decimated. In the American imagination, the War of 1812 became the story of a young nation asserting itself, no longer a colony or an afterthought, but a country with its own destiny. It was the war that forged American symbols, from the Star-Spangled Banner to the legend of the USS Constitution, the Old Ironsides. It was a war that gave rise to heroes: Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Oliver Hazard Perry, men whose names would echo in history and politics. But perhaps most importantly, it was a war that taught Americans to believe in themselves. It was proof that a republic built on the principles of liberty and democracy could stand strong against imperial power. The war instilled a spirit of resilience and self-reliance that would become central to American identity. Looking back, the War of 1812 was not merely a military conflict, it was a defining moment of transformation. It spurred economic modernization, strengthened national unity, and laid the groundwork for America's rise. The echoes of this war continue to reverberate through the nation's history, reminding us that the forging of identity is often born in struggle, tested by adversity, and shaped by the courage to stand firm. The War of 1812 left an indelible mark on America, a nation still young yet growing fast, still imperfect yet full of promise. It was a conflict that shaped more than borders and battles. It shaped the very soul of a country stepping into its future. Chapter 26. How the War of 1812 Shaped North America. The War of 1812, often called America's Forgotten War, was anything but forgotten in the way it shaped the very map and character of North America. It was a conflict that tested borders, challenged empires, and laid the foundation for the modern nations that now stand on this vast continent. As the smoke cleared and peace settled, the legacies of this war began to take shape, not just in treaties and lines on a map, but in the identities, ambitions, and futures of the peoples who called North America home. At its heart, the War of 1812 was a struggle for power and sovereignty. For the United States, it was a battle to assert itself as an independent nation, no longer to be intimidated by British interference or constrained by the lingering shadow of colonialism. For Britain and its North American colonies, future. Canada, it was a defense of territory, trade routes, and imperial interests against a growing and confident neighbor. The war's outcome was paradoxical. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, restored pre-war borders without significant territorial change. Yet this seemingly quiet conclusion belied the profound shifts underway. The peace that followed was more than a cessation of hostilities. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the balance of power across North America. One of the most significant effects of the war was the firm establishment of the United States borders with British North America. The ambiguous boundaries that had fueled tension for decades were now recognized and respected. Though disputes and negotiations would continue, the war marked a turning point where these lines became less battlegrounds and more fixed borders. The Great Lakes region, in particular, emerged as a zone of cooperation rather than conflict, with the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 limiting naval armaments and setting a precedent for peaceful demilitarization. For Canada, the war forged a sense of unity and identity distinct from both Britain and the United States. The successful defense against American invasions and the collective efforts of British regulars, Canadian militia, and Indigenous allies kindled a pride that contributed to Canada's eventual path to nationhood. The memory of battles fought on Canadian soil became part of a shared narrative of resilience, community, and survival. Meanwhile, the war's impact on indigenous nations was devastating and irreversible. Many native tribes, who had allied with the British in hopes of preserving their lands and ways of life, found their position dramatically weakened. The death of leaders like Tecumseh was more than a loss of a military commander. It was the collapse of a pan-indigenous resistance movement that had sought to stand as a sovereign force amid the encroaching powers. The resulting loss of territory and autonomy set a pattern of displacement and marginalization that would continue through the 19th century and beyond. In the United States, the war intensified a spirit of nationalism and manifest destiny. The belief that America was destined to expand across the continent took root more firmly after the conflict. This vision would drive policies and conflicts for decades to come, as settlers pushed westward into native lands and new states emerged from the frontier. The war had demonstrated that the United States was a nation on the rise, determined, resilient, and capable of defending its sovereignty. Economically and militarily, the war was a wake-up call for all parties involved. The British recognized the strategic importance of their North American colonies, but also the costs of defending far-flung territories. The United States saw the need for a stronger navy, a better-trained army, and a more self-sufficient economy. Canadian militias gained experience and confidence, and their role in defending their homeland became a point of national pride. The diplomatic aftermath of the war also shaped future relations. The conflict reinforced the importance of negotiation and treaties in managing relations between neighbors. The concept of a peaceful border between the United States and Canada became a defining feature of the continent, one of the longest unfortified borders in the world, maintained through diplomacy rather than warfare. The lessons of 1812 taught that while disputes were inevitable, violence was not the only path. Culturally, the war left enduring symbols and stories that continue to resonate. The Star-Spangled Banner, born from the bombardment of Fort McHenry, became a lasting emblem of American perseverance and identity. Canadian tales of valor and defense nurtured a collective memory that fed into a distinct national consciousness. Even in Britain, the war was a reminder of the complexities of empire and the challenges of maintaining global power. As the decades passed, the War of 1812 faded from popular memory in some places, overshadowed by later conflicts. Yet its imprint remained in the borders, in the alliances, in the sense of identity and destiny that shaped the course of North American history. It was a war that underscored the fragility and the strength of young nations, the costs of empire, and the enduring power of people determined to chart their own futures. Ultimately, the War of 1812 was a defining moment in the making of modern North America. It was a war that tested boundaries, geographic, political, and cultural, and emerged as a turning point where the continent's nations began to take the shape we recognize today. It was a war that showed the world that the United States was no longer an experiment on the edge of empire, but a force to be reckoned with. It was a war that gave Canada a foundation for identity, separate and proud. It was a war that forever altered the fate of Indigenous peoples, marking a tragic chapter in their history. In the story of North America, the War of 1812 stands as a reminder that borders are not merely lines on a map. They are the product of struggle, negotiation, and human endurance. It reminds us that nations are more than governments. They are communities shaped by shared history, sacrifice, and the will to survive. As we reflect on this conflict, nearly 2 centuries later, the echoes of the War of 1812 continue to shape our understanding of identity, sovereignty, and the complex tapestry that is North America. It was a war that ended with a treaty, but began a legacy of nations defined not just by land, but by the stories they tell, the battles they fought, and the futures they dared to imagine.